long before empires were drawn on maps, long before the world decided whose history was worth remembering. There were people in North America, and they left behind questions that no civilization on any continent has ever been able to answer. Structures that shouldn't exist. Disappearances with no bodies, no trails, no explanations. Sacred knowledge so carefully guarded it survived centuries of erasure, and still surfaces today in ways that unsettle even the most skeptical researchers. These mysteries belong to no single nation. They belong to human history. Get comfortable, because what comes next will make you question what you thought you knew. High on the sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, carved into the face of canyon walls that drop hundreds of feet to the desert floor below, there are rooms, hundreds of them. Multi-story dwellings built with extraordinary precision. Doorways aligned to catch the winter solstice sun, walls plastered smooth, storage chambers still sealed as though their owners intended to return. The kivas, circular ceremonial chambers dug into the earth, sit silent. The grinding stones rest exactly where they were left. And yet, for over 700 years, not a single person has lived here. This is Mesa Verde, and it is one of the most carefully constructed and most completely abandoned places on Earth. The people who built it are known today as the Ancestral Puebloans, though for much of the 20th century they were called the Anasazi, a Navajo term that translates, depending on the source, as Ancient Ones or Ancient Enemies. They emerged as a distinct culture around 100 BC in the Four Corners region, where the modern borders of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico converge. For over 1,000 years, they developed sophisticated architecture, complex road systems, and astronomical knowledge precise enough to orient entire cities toward celestial events. Their largest settlement, Chaco Canyon, functioned as a regional hub, a place of ceremony, trade, and possibly governance, connected to outlying communities by hundreds of miles of engineered roads that ran, inexplicably, in perfectly straight lines across terrain that offered no practical reason for such precision. Then, around 1300 AD, they were gone. Not dead, not conquered, simply elsewhere. The mainstream explanation points to a convergence of pressures. Tree ring data, one of the most reliable tools archaeologists have for reading the past, reveals a severe and prolonged drought that gripped the region between 1276 and 1299 AD. Nearly a quarter century without reliable rainfall in a landscape that was already unforgiving. Agricultural systems that had sustained tens of thousands of people began to fail. Resources became scarce. Communities that had coexisted for generations may have turned on one another. Evidence of violence has been found at several sites. Burnt structures, skeletal remains showing signs of trauma. At a site called Castle Rock Pueblo, archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 41 individuals, many bearing marks consistent with conflict. Some researchers have gone further, presenting evidence they interpret as ritual processing of human remains, a conclusion that remains deeply contested, and one that modern Pueblo communities, who consider the ancestral Puebloans their direct ancestors, have responded to with understandable complexity. But drought and conflict, even together, don't fully close the case. Other civilizations have endured worse and stayed. And the migration itself raises questions that the environmental argument alone cannot answer. Where exactly did they go? The descendant communities, the Hopi, the Zuni, the various Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, carry oral traditions that speak of long journeys, of being called to new places by spiritual necessity, of cycles of emergence and return woven into their understanding of time itself. In these accounts, the departure from Mesa Verde was not a catastrophe. It was a completion. That distinction matters, because it shifts the question from what drove them away to something far more difficult to measure. What were they moving toward? The canyon walls hold no written answer. The sealed rooms offer no explanation. And the roads, those impossibly straight roads stretching across the desert, simply end, pointing outward toward a horizon that still hasn't given anything back. What exactly were they following? before moving to the next mystery. If you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. We followed the roads, and the roads led us here, to a place that, at first glance, seems to have no reason to exist. A wide, flat basin in the high desert of what is now northwestern New Mexico. No river runs through it. No forest surrounds it. The soil is thin, the winters brutal, the summers unforgiving. By almost every practical measure, this is not a place where a civilization should have chosen to concentrate its greatest ambitions. And yet, sometime around 850 AD, the ancestral Puebloans began building here on a scale that still stops researchers mid-sentence. Chaco Canyon is not simply a collection of ruins. It is a statement. Spread across roughly 16 kilometers of canyon floor and surrounding mesa are the remains of at least 12 major structures. Great houses, as archaeologists call them, constructed from millions of pieces of shaped sandstone, hauled and fitted with a precision that required both advanced planning and a workforce organized across generations. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, contains over 600 rooms across 5 stories. It was, for centuries, one of the largest buildings in North America. And it was built not by accident or gradual accumulation, but according to a design that was clearly envisioned long before the first stone was laid. That deliberateness is what makes Chaco so difficult to categorize. The physical evidence is extraordinary on its own terms. Walls were constructed using a core and veneer technique, a rubble core faced with carefully selected and shaped stone that archaeologists have identified as requiring specialist knowledge passed deliberately between builders across time. Timbers used in construction were transported from forests more than 80 kilometers away, in a landscape with no wheeled transport and no large domesticated animals. Hundreds of kilometers of roads, engineered to a consistent width of roughly 9 meters, connected Chaco to outlying communities spread across a region the size of a modern European country. These roads did not meander with the terrain. They cut through it, straight lines, maintained with an insistence that goes well beyond functional necessity. Why build a road in a perfectly straight line across broken desert when a curved path would be easier to walk? That question has no fully satisfying answer. Some researchers have suggested the roads served a ceremonial function, that straightness itself carried meaning, perhaps connecting the physical world to cosmological principles embedded in ancestral Puebloan belief. Others have pointed to the roads as evidence of a political system, a Chacoan regional network through which goods, labor, and authority moved. Both explanations may be partially correct. Neither feels complete. The astronomical alignments complicate the picture further. The great houses are not randomly oriented. Pueblo Bonito's walls align almost precisely with the cardinal directions. A structure known as the Casa Rinconada, a great kiva, or communal ceremonial chamber among the largest ever found, is oriented so that on the morning of the summer solstice, light enters through a specific window and illuminates a niche on the opposite wall. Whether this was intentional or coincidental has been debated for decades, but Chaco is not an isolated case. Across the canyon, at a site on a nearby mesa called Fajada Butte, a spiral petroglyph was found positioned so that daggers of sunlight pierce it at precise moments, marking the solstices, the equinoxes, and even the 18-year cycle of the moon's orbital shift. The knowledge required to design and calibrate such a marker is not casual. It is the product of generations of careful observation. What were they watching for? And why did it matter so urgently that they encoded it into stone? The population question adds another layer of unease. Estimates suggest that Chaco Canyon itself may have housed only a few hundred permanent residents at any given time, a number that seems wildly disproportionate to the scale of what was built there. Some researchers now believe Chaco was not primarily a residential center at all, but a place of pilgrimage, a sacred destination that drew people from across the wider network for ceremonies, gatherings, and rituals whose nature we can only partially reconstruct. The quantities of turquoise found in burial deposits at Pueblo Bonito, tens of thousands of pieces, support the idea of a place where wealth and ceremony intersected on an extraordinary scale. Macaw feathers, imported from what is now central Mexico. Copper bells. Cacao residue in cylindrical vessels that mirror forms used in Mesoamerican ritual contexts. Chaco was connected, deliberately and purposefully, to a world far larger than its canyon walls suggest. That connection has led some researchers into more speculative territory. The parallels between Chacoan cosmology and certain Mesoamerican traditions, the emphasis on solar and lunar cycles, the use of specific architectural orientations, the presence of trade goods from cultures hundreds of kilometers to the south, have prompted questions about the nature of that contact. Was it trade alone? Was there ideological exchange? Some have proposed that Chaco functioned as a kind of northernmost node in a much wider network of sacred geography, its roads not merely connecting communities but tracing lines of meaning across a landscape understood in ways modern cartography cannot capture. These are theories. They are carefully noted as such, but they persist because the conventional explanations keep leaving gaps that the evidence refuses to fill. Around 1150 AD, construction at Chaco effectively ceased. The great houses were not destroyed. They were not buried. They were simply left. Their rooms sealed, their roads still pointing outward across the desert. The same departure, the same deliberate silence that we encountered at Mesa Verde. And that raises a question that no excavation has yet been able to answer. If Chaco was built to serve a purpose, astronomical, ceremonial, political, or something that defies our modern categories entirely, what happened to that purpose when the people left? Did it end? Or did it simply move somewhere we haven't thought to look? Whatever moved on from Chaco Canyon, it carried knowledge with it. Knowledge of the earth, of materials, of how to extract meaning and metal from landscapes that most people would look at and see nothing at all. And long before the great houses of Chaco were ever conceived, long before the first road was laid across the New Mexico desert, someone else had already been doing exactly that. On the cold northern shores of a lake so vast it behaves like an inland sea, they had been pulling something extraordinary out of the ground, in quantities that, even today, are difficult to fully explain. Lake Superior sits at the northern edge of the North American continent, straddling what is now the border between the United States and Canada. It is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area. Its waters are deep, clear, and bitterly cold. Its shoreline is ancient, shaped by glacial forces that retreated roughly 10,000 years ago and left behind in the exposed bedrock of Michigan's Upper Peninsula and the islands that scatter its surface, one of the most remarkable geological anomalies in the world. Copper. Pure, native copper. Not ore requiring smelting, not rock that needs to be chemically processed to yield metal. Just copper in its raw, workable form, lying in veins and masses throughout the stone, some pieces weighing hundreds, even thousands of kilograms. For any culture with the knowledge to recognize what it was looking at, this would have been an astonishing find. And someone, a very long time ago, found it. Archaeological investigation of the Lake Superior copper region began seriously in the 19th century, and what researchers uncovered fundamentally disrupted assumptions about the complexity of pre-contact North American cultures. Across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale, surveyors and excavators found mining pits. Thousands of them. Estimates vary, but some researchers place the total number of ancient excavations across the region at over 10,000 individual sites. The pits ranged from shallow surface workings to shafts descending several meters into bedrock. Scattered throughout were stone hammers, mauls, shaped and used to break copper free from the surrounding rock, in numbers that suggest sustained, organized, large-scale extraction over an extended period. The dating was what stopped people in their tracks. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material recovered from the mining sites, wooden tools, charcoal from ancient fires, placed the earliest activity at approximately 5000 BC. Some estimates push earlier still. The mining operations appear to have peaked between roughly 3000 and 1000 BC, and then, with a quiet that mirrors the later silence of Chaco and Mesa Verde, they largely ceased. For somewhere between 3 and 5,000 years, people in this region had been systematically extracting copper on an industrial scale. Then they stopped. The volume of copper removed is the detail that researchers keep returning to. Conservative estimates suggest that somewhere between 100 million and 500 million pounds of copper were extracted from the Lake Superior region during this period. Those numbers are not misprints, and they immediately produce a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. Where did it all go? The Hopewell and Adena cultures of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys used Lake Superior copper extensively for ceremonial objects, ornaments, tools, and grave goods that archaeologists have recovered at sites spread across a vast portion of eastern North America. The copper network that radiated outward from the Great Lakes region touched communities from the Gulf Coast to the Atlantic seaboard. But even accounting for everything that has been found, the material recovered represents a small fraction, of what the geological and archaeological record suggests was removed. The arithmetic does not balance. And when arithmetic fails in archaeology, the questions that fill the gap tend to become uncomfortable ones. Some researchers have proposed that the scale of the operation implies a level of social organization, a coordinated, purposeful extraction economy, that challenges long-held assumptions about the cultures of this period. The logistics alone are staggering. Mining on this scale requires not just labor, but planning. People who knew where to dig, how to move what they extracted, and how to distribute it across distances that, without horses or wheeled transport, demanded extraordinary human effort. This was not casual or opportunistic. It was systematic. The more speculative threads pull in directions that mainstream archaeology treats with caution, but is not entirely dismissed. The timeline of the Lake Superior mining operations overlaps in striking ways with the Bronze Age in Europe and the Near East, a period during which demand for copper, one of the two essential components of bronze, was intense and widespread. Some researchers, working from that overlap and from the anomaly of the missing copper, have raised the possibility of transatlantic contact, a hypothesis that the academic consensus has generally resisted, but which a small and persistent body of researchers continues to examine through the lens of ancient seafaring capabilities, ocean current patterns, and archaeological parallels between Old World and New World material cultures. These ideas sit at the edge of the field, not at its center. They are noted here not as conclusions, but as questions, the kind of questions that surface when the conventional framework leaves too much unexplained. What is not in dispute is the operation itself. Thousands of pits, millions of stone hammers, copper extracted across millennia in quantities that modern industry would not consider trivial. A sudden stop, with no clear recorded reason, and a distribution gap that no inventory of recovered artifacts has yet been able to close. Somewhere beneath the cold water and the dark northern pines, the ground still holds what it knows, and it has not finished keeping its secrets. The copper moved. That much we know. It traveled south and east, passing through hands and across distances that still astonish researchers who trace its journey. And somewhere along those ancient trade routes, those invisible arteries connecting the far north to the heart of the continent, it passed through a place that was, for a brief and remarkable period, the largest city in pre-contact North America. A city that most people alive today have never heard of. Stand on the flat floodplain of the Mississippi River, just east of where the city of St. Louis now sits, and look across the landscape of southern Illinois. At first glance, it appears unremarkable. The land is level, agricultural, ordinary. But look more carefully, and the flatness begins to resolve into something else. A series of deliberate elevations rising from the plain, too regular in their geometry, too purposeful in their arrangement, to be natural formations. There are more than 100 of them. Earthen mounds, built entirely by human hands, spread across an area of roughly 20 square kilometers. At the center of it all, rising approximately 30 meters above the surrounding plain in 4 broad terraces, is a structure known as Monk's Mound. Its base covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It contains more earth, by volume, than several of Egypt's most famous monuments. It was built without metal tools, without draft animals, without the wheel, carried basket by basket, load by load, over generations, by people whose names we do not know and whose language left no written record. This is Cahokia, and it demands to be taken seriously. The settlement began to emerge around 700 AD, but it was in the century following 1050 AD that something remarkable happened. In what archaeologists have termed the Cahokia Big Bang, the site transformed with unusual speed from a modest collection of villages into a fully realized urban center. Population estimates for this period range from 10,000 to as many as 20,000 people living within the city itself, with tens of thousands more in surrounding communities. For its time and place, this was extraordinary. Cahokia was, by the standards of the medieval world, a major city, larger than London at the same period, comparable in scale to many European urban centers that history has treated with far greater attention. The planning evident at Cahokia is what elevates it beyond the merely impressive into something genuinely puzzling. The mounds are not randomly distributed. They are arranged around a series of open plazas, oriented along a north-south axis, aligned with remarkable precision to true north. A large circle of wooden posts, archaeologists call it Woodhenge, was positioned to function as a solar calendar, its posts aligned to mark the solstices and equinoxes with the same deliberate astronomical awareness seen at Chaco Canyon, hundreds of kilometers to the southwest. The connections between these cultures, separated by distance but sharing a common orientation toward the sky, are not easily dismissed as coincidence. Beneath Monk's Mound itself, excavations have revealed evidence of large timber structures at its summit, buildings that may have served as residences or ceremonial spaces for whoever held authority in this place. A burial site nearby, designated Mound 72, contained the remains of a man laid upon a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Around him were the remains of over 250 other individuals, many of them young women, deposited in a pattern suggesting ritual sacrifice on a scale that reframes assumptions about the nature of Cahokian power. Whoever this man was, his death was marked by the deaths of others. His authority in life or in symbolic representation extended over the lives and bodies of those around him. That detail has pushed some researchers toward comparisons with Old World chiefdom structures, the kinds of hierarchical, ceremonially intensive political systems more commonly associated with early state formation in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley. The idea that a comparable structure emerged independently in the Mississippi Valley, reaching its apex and then dissolving within roughly 3 centuries, raises questions about what conditions produce such concentrations of power and what causes them to collapse. Because collapse is what happened. By around 1350 AD, Cahokia was effectively abandoned. The plazas emptied. The mounds were left to the grass. The population dispersed, and the city that had dominated the center of a continent faded so completely that when European explorers arrived centuries later, they found no living memory of who had built what they were looking at. The local cultures they encountered did not claim it. The mound simply stood there, unexplained, in a landscape that had moved on. The reasons proposed for this abandonment follow a now familiar pattern: drought, environmental degradation from intensive agriculture and deforestation, internal social strain, possible conflict. Tree ring data again suggests climate stress during this period, and there is evidence in the form of a defensive wooden palisade built around the central precinct in Cahokia's later years that the city felt threatened from somewhere. Whether that threat was external or internal remains unresolved. Some researchers have pointed to evidence of flooding, that the very river system that made the location agriculturally rich also made it catastrophically vulnerable during periods of sustained rainfall. Others have focused on what they interpret as signs of elite overreach, a ruling class that demanded too much from a population that eventually simply walked away. But walking away from a city of this scale, from the infrastructure, the trade networks, the accumulated knowledge of generations, is not a small decision. It is the kind of decision people make when staying has become impossible. What made it impossible? Monk's Mound still rises from the Illinois plain. The mounds still hold their geometry, and the man on the bed of shells, whoever he was, still lies where he was placed, surrounded by the evidence of a power so complete it required the deaths of others to mark his passing. What he ruled and what undid it remains an open question. Power, it seems, does not simply vanish. It disperses. It travels along old routes, settles into new landscapes, and encodes itself into the one medium that no flood, no drought, and no abandonment can fully destroy: story. While archaeologists piece together the physical remnants of Cahokia, of Chaco, of Mesa Verde, reading the earth for clues about people who left no written language, there is another archive that has been present all along, one that was spoken rather than inscribed, carried not in stone or copper or shell beads, but in the careful, deliberate transmission of memory from one generation to the next, across centuries of disruption and survival. The Zuni people of the American Southwest have maintained one of the most intact and continuously documented oral traditions on the continent. Their stories describe, with a geographic and historical specificity that has repeatedly caught the attention of researchers, a series of places, cities, in the way the word is used loosely, that existed before the Zuni settled in their present homeland along the Zuni River in what is now western New Mexico. These were not vague mythological spaces. They were described with detail, their locations relative to rivers and mountains, the materials from which they were built, the nature of the people who inhabited them, and the circumstances under which they were left behind. The Spanish, when they arrived in the Southwest in the 16th century, heard versions of these stories and transformed them into something else entirely. The Zuni accounts of wealthy, well-constructed cities to the north and west became, filtered through European desire and colonial imagination, the legend of the Seven Cities of Gold, Cibola, the name the Spanish gave to a place they never found and that may never have existed in the form they were seeking. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led a large and costly expedition northward in 1540, expecting to find streets paved with precious metal and buildings encrusted with turquoise. What he found instead were the Zuni Pueblos themselves, substantial, organized, and clearly the product of a sophisticated culture, but not the gleaming cities of European fantasy. The Spanish had mistranslated the tradition. That much is clear. But the more interesting question, the one that lingers after the colonial distortion is set aside, is what the Zuni stories were actually describing before they were filtered through someone else's expectations. Ethnographic work conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly by anthropologist Frank Hamilton Cushing, who lived among the Zuni for several years, produced detailed documentation of their oral traditions. The accounts gathered during this period described a series of ancestral villages spread across a landscape much wider than the present Zuni homeland, places the people had lived during what their tradition calls the long journey, the process of migration and searching that preceded their arrival at the place they were meant to settle. These villages were not mythological abstractions. They were remembered with the kind of specific, practical detail that tends to indicate genuine inherited memory. Directions of travel, water sources, the duration of occupation, the reasons for departure. Archaeological investigation has, in several cases, found physical evidence consistent with these accounts. Sites in the region that align with Zuni oral descriptions of ancestral locations have been excavated and dated to periods that match the time frames the traditions imply. This correspondence between spoken memory and material record has led some researchers to argue that Zuni oral tradition functions as a form of historical documentation, imprecise by the standards of written record, but far more reliable than it was once assumed to be. The more contested element of the Zuni tradition involves descriptions of places that have not yet been found, or that have been found in forms that raise further questions. Some accounts describe large, multi-story settlements in areas where current archaeology has recovered only limited evidence of occupation. Others speak of places associated with specific ceremonies or materials, sources of particular clays, locations where certain minerals were gathered. That suggests a geographic knowledge extending well beyond the present Zuni territory. A small number of researchers have proposed that some of these described locations may lie in areas that have not been systematically excavated, or in landscapes so altered by centuries of erosion and agricultural use that the surface evidence has been obscured. There is also, threading through the Zuni accounts, a recurring motif that resists easy categorization. The tradition describes, among the ancestral places, locations associated with particular kinds of spiritual power. Places where the boundary between the physical world and what the Zuni understand as the deeper structure of reality was considered unusually permeable. These were not simply residential sites. They were places with a specific quality, a specific weight that made them significant beyond their practical function. The ceremonies associated with them were not casual. They were carefully maintained, passed down with the same seriousness as the geographic descriptions themselves. What that significance meant in practice, what actually occurred at these locations, what knowledge was cultivated there and why, is not something the documentary record fully captures. Ceremonial knowledge within Zuni tradition is not freely shared with outsiders, and for reasons that the history of the past 5 centuries makes entirely understandable. What has been shared is enough to indicate depth. What remains private is, by design, not available for outside analysis, and that itself is worth sitting with, because it means that the archive is not closed, it is simply not fully open, the stories are still being held, the knowledge is still being carried. Somewhere within a living tradition that has survived conquest, forced relocation, and every form of cultural pressure the modern world has applied, the memory of those places endures. Which raises a question that archaeology alone cannot answer. What do the Zuni still remember that the rest of the world has not yet thought to ask about? There are things the Zuni remember that the rest of the world has not yet thought to ask about. And there are things the desert itself remembers, encoded not in story, but in the earth, in the stone, and in the ghostly geometry of channels that once carried water across one of the most hostile landscapes on the continent. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was built. Drive through the Salt River Valley of southern Arizona today, and you move through one of the fastest-growing urban regions in the United States. Phoenix spreads across the desert floor in every direction, roads, subdivisions, commercial corridors stretching toward a horizon that shimmers in the heat. It is a city defined, above almost everything else, by its relationship with water. Canals bring it in. Infrastructure distributes it. The desert is held at bay by an engineering system that requires constant maintenance and significant resources to sustain. This is not a new arrangement. It is, in the most direct sense, an inheritance. Beneath the streets of modern Phoenix, and extending outward across the valley in traces that aerial photography and ground survey have spent decades mapping, lies the remnant of a canal system that was, at its height, among the most sophisticated pre-industrial irrigation networks ever constructed in the Americas. Hundreds of kilometers of channels, some reaching widths of 15 meters and depths of 3, moved water from the Salt and Gila rivers across the desert floor to agricultural fields that sustained a population estimated at its peak to number in the tens of thousands. The engineering required to build and maintain this system, the surveying, the gradient calculations, the organizational capacity to coordinate labor across a large and distributed population, was not primitive. It was the product of a culture that understood its landscape with a precision that modern hydrologists have found genuinely impressive. The people who built it are known today as the Hohokam, a name derived from the O'odham language that translates, with an echo that is difficult to ignore, as those who have gone or the used-up people. They emerged as a distinct cultural tradition around 1 AD in the Sonoran Desert, and for over 1,000 years they developed, refined, and expanded their presence across a region that most outside observers would have considered inhospitable to large-scale settlement. They built platform mounds, earthen structures that served ceremonial and possibly administrative functions, their flat tops supporting buildings whose remains indicate they were not ordinary dwellings. They maintained a ball court tradition, constructing oval earthen courts whose form and apparent function bear striking similarities to the ballgame complexes found throughout Mesoamerica, hundreds of kilometers to the south. They produced distinctive red-on-buff pottery of considerable artistic sophistication. They traded extensively, shells from the Gulf of California, copper bells from Mesoamerican workshops, macaw feathers, and live birds maintained in captivity far from their natural range. And then, somewhere between 1375 and 1450 AD, the Hohokam world came apart. The process was not instantaneous. Evidence suggests a gradual unraveling across several generations. Population appears to have declined. Large sites were abandoned. The canal system, which had required constant collective labor to maintain, began to deteriorate in ways that suggest the social organization capable of sustaining it was weakening. By the mid-15th century, the major Hohokam centers were empty, and the desert was reclaiming the fields that the canals had kept alive. The environmental pressures were real and are well documented. Dendrochronology, the same tree ring record that illuminated the collapse at Mesa Verde, reveals a pattern of severe flooding in the early 14th century, followed by prolonged drought. The Salt and Gila rivers, the arteries of the entire Hohokam system, were not stable providers. They flooded catastrophically, destroying canal infrastructure that had taken generations to build. Then they shrank. The agricultural system that had sustained the population through careful water management became, under these conditions, increasingly unreliable. Fields failed. Stored surpluses were depleted. Communities that had been bound together by the shared necessity of maintaining the canals found, perhaps, that the center could no longer hold. But environmental stress, again, does not fully close the account. Other cultures in other landscapes have absorbed comparable pressures and found ways to adapt. The Hohokam had, over more than a millennium, demonstrated a remarkable capacity to manage their difficult environment. Something in the 14th and 15th centuries overwhelmed that capacity in ways that go beyond what the climate record alone can explain. Evidence of conflict has been found at several late Hohokam sites: trauma on skeletal remains, burned structures, defensive positioning of settlements. Some researchers have proposed that the same pressures driving environmental stress were simultaneously producing social fractures, competition over shrinking resources, and violence between communities that had previously been bound by trade and shared infrastructure. The platform mound sites, in their later phases, show signs of increasing social stratification, a narrowing of access to resources and decision-making that may have eroded the cooperative foundation the entire canal system depended upon. There are more speculative threads. A minority of researchers has examined the Hohokam disappearance alongside the broader pattern of southwestern abandonments: Chaco, Mesa Verde, and now the Salt River Valley, and asked whether something systemic was moving through the region, a cascade of pressures whose individual components are explicable, but whose combined effect produced a kind of civilizational exhaustion that no single cause can account for. The O'odham people of southern Arizona, widely regarded as the Hohokam's descendants, did not lose the knowledge of the canals. When American settlers arrived in the Salt River Valley in the 19th century, it was O'odham guides who showed them where the ancient channels ran. It was that inherited geographic memory, that quiet, persistent knowing, that informed the placement of the modern irrigation system that Phoenix still depends on today. The canals the city drinks from follow paths that were first cut more than 1,000 years ago, by people whose disappearance even now remains only partially explained. What did they understand about this desert that we are still, slowly, learning to read? The desert remembers. The O'odham knew where the old canals ran not because they read about them, but because the knowledge was passed down, body to body, voice to voice, generation to generation. That kind of memory does not fabricate. It preserves. And when a tradition persists across centuries with that level of consistency, the careful researcher learns to pay attention. Which brings us to a category of story that appears, with remarkable consistency, across an extraordinary number of distinct and geographically separated Native American traditions. Not a shared mythology borrowed from a single source, not a motif that can be explained by cultural contact alone, but a recurring account told independently by peoples who had no documented connection to one another, describing the same thing: people of unusual size. And what became of them? The traditions are not obscure. They are among the most widely documented elements of Native American oral literature, recorded by ethnographers, missionaries, government surveyors, and anthropologists across more than 3 centuries of contact. The Paiute of the Great Basin spoke of a red-haired race of cannibalistic giants they called the Sitaka, whom their ancestors had driven into a cave and destroyed by fire. The Choctaw of the southeast described a race of large, powerful people called the Nahulo, who occupied the land before them and were eventually displaced. The Comanche spoke of giant predecessors on the plains. The Aztec, in accounts recorded by Spanish chroniclers, described encountering the bones of enormous people when they arrived in central Mexico and brought those bones back to exhibit as proof of a former race. Various nations of the Pacific Northwest carried accounts of giant beings associated with specific landscapes, mountains, river valleys, coastal regions, whose presence in the land predated human memory. The sheer geographic spread of these accounts is the first thing that resists easy dismissal. From the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, traditions describing unusually large predecessors or contemporaries appear in culture after culture, told by peoples with no common origin and no established lines of transmission between them. The conventional anthropological response has been to classify these accounts as mythology, as symbolic narratives expressing ideas about power, fear, or the unknown, rather than literal descriptions of physical beings. That interpretation may be correct, but it does not fully explain the specificity. The Paiute account of the Sitaka is perhaps the most examined because it intersects with a physical location that can be investigated. Lovelock Cave, in what is now northwestern Nevada, was excavated by archaeologists beginning in 1912. What they found inside was significant: thousands of artifacts, evidence of long occupation, and, among the remains, a number of mummies and skeletal fragments that drew immediate attention because of certain physical characteristics, including, in several cases, hair that appeared reddish in color, though researchers have since noted that dark hair can take on reddish tones through the chemical processes of mummification. The individuals recovered were not, by the skeletal measurements taken at the time, outside the normal range of human height, but the discrepancy between what the physical evidence showed and what the Paiute tradition described generated a debate that is never fully resolved. Some researchers have proposed that the Paiute account describes a real historical conflict with a culturally distinct group, a people who were genuinely different in appearance and behavior, whose physical otherness was amplified and transformed by the process of oral transmission across generations into something more extreme than the original. Under this interpretation, the giants are a memory of real people, distorted by time and the natural tendency of storytelling to heighten contrast and clarify moral stakes. The red hair becomes redder. The tall become taller. The dangerous become monstrous. Others have taken the physical record more literally. A minority of researchers, working outside the mainstream of professional archaeology, has argued that skeletal remains of genuinely large individuals have been recovered from burial sites across North America and subsequently misclassified, misreported, or in some cases removed from the public record. This argument has circulated widely in popular literature and has been the subject of considerable controversy. The Smithsonian Institution, which has been named specifically in some of these claims as a repository for suppressed giant remains, has consistently denied the allegations. The scientific consensus does not support the existence of a race of giants in North American prehistory. And yet the stories persist, and their persistence is itself a data point. Oral traditions are not maintained casually. They require investment, the commitment of memory, the repetition of telling, the social structures that make transmission possible across generations. Traditions that survive for centuries without a physical or experiential anchor tend to fade or transform beyond recognition. The specificity and durability of the giant accounts across so many distinct cultures suggests that something, some experience, some encounter, some physical reality, generated and sustained them. What that something was remains genuinely open. The mythological interpretation is reasonable. The distorted memory interpretation is plausible. The literal interpretation is contested and largely unsupported by the available physical evidence. None of these positions fully accounts for the consistency of the tradition across cultures that had no reason to be telling the same story. There is one further detail that tends to surface in these accounts, across multiple traditions, that is worth noting before moving on. The giants, in almost every telling, are gone. They were defeated, or they died out, or they were driven away, or they simply disappeared before the present people arrived. They are always, in some sense, what came before, a prior world that had to end before this one could begin. Why, across so many different cultures and landscapes, did people feel the need to remember and transmit the story of what had to be cleared away before they could exist? What were they trying not to forget? Every tradition we have examined carries within it the same underlying question. What came before, and what did it know? The giants, whatever they were, represented in the stories of dozens of cultures a prior world, a prior order that had to pass before the present could begin. But there is another kind of prior knowledge that the traditions describe, one that did not disappear with the beings who held it, one that was instead carefully preserved, encoded into the most durable medium available to people without writing: the night sky. Step away from any city, anywhere on Earth, and look up on a clear night. What you see is what every human being who has ever lived saw: a vast, rotating field of light, moving with a regularity so precise that it constitutes, if you know how to read it, a clock, a calendar, a compass, and a map simultaneously. For cultures without writing, the sky was not decoration. It was infrastructure. And the indigenous peoples of North America developed relationships with it that modern astronomy is only now beginning to fully appreciate. The Lakota of the Great Plains carry one of the most extensively documented star knowledge traditions on the continent. Their understanding of the night sky was not casual observation. It was a structured, transmitted body of knowledge in which specific star groupings were identified, named, and associated with specific times of year, specific ceremonial obligations, and specific teachings about the nature of the world. The Lakota identified what they called the backbone of the world, a dark constellation defined not by stars but by the dark rifts in the Milky Way, the dust lanes that obscure the galactic center. This form of astronomical knowledge, reading darkness rather than light, is a sophisticated observational technique that requires sustained multi-generational attention to the sky. It was not arrived at quickly. The Cherokee maintained detailed knowledge of the Pleiades, the star cluster known in Western astronomy by its Greek name, but recognized independently by cultures on every inhabited continent. In Cherokee tradition, the Pleiades were connected to agricultural timing, to ceremony, and to a specific story about 7 boys who rose into the sky rather than return to a world that had failed them. The story encodes the cluster's behavior, its seasonal rising and setting, into a narrative form that preserves the astronomical information across generations who might never have access to the abstract technical language of observational science. The story is the data. This is a principle that researchers in the emerging field of cultural astronomy, or archaeoastronomy, have found repeatedly across indigenous traditions worldwide. Astronomical information, the timing of celestial events, the behavior of specific stars and planets, the cycles of the moon, was embedded in narrative, ceremony, and material culture in ways that ensured its survival even when the explicit technical knowledge was disrupted. The Skeety Pawnee of the Central Plains organized their entire ceremonial calendar around the stars, maintaining a star chart painted on an elk hide that is among the most sophisticated pre-contact astronomical documents known from North America. Their villages were laid out to mirror specific star patterns. Their ceremonies were timed to celestial events with a precision that required ongoing, careful observation maintained across generations. What has begun to unsettle researchers is not the existence of this knowledge that has been documented for decades, but its depth and what that depth implies about the timescales involved. Some indigenous traditions contain astronomical references that appear to describe celestial configurations that have not been visible from Earth for thousands of years. Precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars relative to the horizon to shift over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, means that the night sky visible today is measurably different from the sky visible 5,000 years ago, and dramatically different from the sky of 10,000 years ago. If a tradition contains accurate descriptions of stellar positions or celestial events consistent only with a particular precession period, that tradition may preserve observational data from a time far earlier than the culture's known history. This is a claim that requires careful handling. The archaeoastronomical analysis involved is technically demanding, interpretively complex, and contested within the field. But it has been applied seriously to several indigenous traditions, and in some cases the results are difficult to explain without either accepting a very deep antiquity for the knowledge in question or proposing an alternative mechanism by which accurate ancient astronomical data entered and was preserved within living oral traditions. The Hopi of the American Southwest offer one of the more discussed examples. Their ceremonial cycle is organized around the Pleiades, the solstices, and the behavior of specific planets, with a precision that researchers have traced backward through precession models to configurations that may correspond to periods several thousand years before the Hopi's known archaeological horizon. Whether this represents genuinely ancient inherited knowledge, independent rediscovery of the same astronomical patterns, or an artifact of interpretive method, remains actively debated. There is a broader implication in all of this that tends to be underemphasized in the technical literature. The preservation of astronomical knowledge across thousands of years through the disruptions of migration, conflict, climate change, and colonial violence required not just the knowledge itself, but the social and ceremonial infrastructure to transmit it. The ceremonies were not decorative. They were functional, mechanisms for ensuring that what was known would continue to be known generation after generation in the absence of any technology more durable than human memory and human commitment. That infrastructure was deliberately targeted for destruction across several centuries of colonial policy. Ceremonies were outlawed. Languages were suppressed. The people who held the knowledge were separated from the children who would have received it. And yet the knowledge survived. Imperfectly, incompletely, but stubbornly. In the traditions that endured, in the communities that maintained them, in the stories still being told under skies that have been shifting, slowly and imperceptibly, for longer than any written record reaches. What was known before the disruption that has not yet been fully recovered, and how much of the sky's oldest story is still waiting to be read. The sky, it turns out, was not the only thing they were reading. The same impulse that drove generations of indigenous astronomers to encode the movements of stars into story and ceremony. That deep, patient attention to pattern, to cycle, to the relationship between the human world and something larger than it, expressed itself on the ground as well. In earth, in form, in the deliberate shaping of landscape into geometry so precise that it could only have been conceived by people who understood, at a fundamental level, the relationship between what is above and what is below. We have seen this at Chaco, where buildings align to solstice light. At Cahokia, where mounds trace celestial orientations across the Mississippi floodplain. Now we travel further back, much further, to a place that pushes all of these questions earlier than most people expect them to go. To northeastern Louisiana, to a bend in the Macon Ridge above the floodplain of the Bayou Macon, where the land has been shaped into something that, from the ground, appears to be nothing more than a series of low, grassy ridges. Unremarkable. Easy to walk past without registering what you are standing inside. From the air, it is an entirely different thing. Poverty Point is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though it remains far less visited and far less discussed than its scale and age deserve. What the aerial view reveals is a set of 6 concentric C-shaped earthen ridges, nested inside one another like the rings of a vast open amphitheater, oriented toward the west and the setting sun. The outermost ridge spans roughly 1.2 kilometers across. The entire earthwork complex covers an area of nearly 5 square kilometers. At the western edge, a large mound, Mound A, rises 11 meters above the surrounding terrain, its form, when viewed from above, resembling a bird in flight, its wings spread across more than 200 meters of carefully placed earth. The dating is what reframes everything. Poverty Point was constructed primarily between approximately 1700 and 1100 BC. This places its peak construction period in the Late Bronze Age, contemporary with Mycenaean Greece, with the later phases of Egyptian New Kingdom, with the civilizations of the ancient Near East. In North America, it predates the Hopewell culture by over 1,000 years, Cahokia by over 2,000. It is, by a significant margin, one of the earliest and largest earthwork complexes in the Western Hemisphere, and its builders have no agreed-upon name. No descendant culture has been definitively identified. No tradition has been unambiguously traced back to them. They are known only by what they left, and what they left raises questions that the field has been debating for decades. The construction of Poverty Point required the movement of an estimated 238,000 cubic meters of earth, carried and placed by hand in a landscape with no draft animals and no wheeled transport. Modeling studies have attempted to calculate the labor this implies, and the numbers are significant. Some estimates suggest the project required millions of person-hours of sustained, coordinated effort. What social structure makes that level of coordination possible without the institutional frameworks, taxation, coerced labor, centralized political authority, that archaeologists typically associate with large-scale construction projects? The conventional answer has shifted significantly in recent years. Earlier scholarship assumed that the scale of Poverty Point implied a complex hierarchical society, a chiefdom or proto-state capable of directing large workforces across extended periods. More recent research, including detailed stratigraphic analysis of how the ridges were actually built, has complicated this picture considerably. A study published in 2020 proposed, on the basis of sediment analysis, that the main ridge system at Poverty Point may have been constructed with extraordinary speed, potentially in as little as 30 to 90 days. If accurate, this would transform the interpretive framework entirely. Not a generations-long civic project directed by a permanent authority, but a massive, rapid mobilization of a large population for a specific, time-limited purpose. What purpose? What would bring thousands of people together from across a wide region, and the trade goods at Poverty Point confirm a regional network, with materials arriving from the Great Lakes, the Appalachians, and the Gulf Coast, to build, in a matter of weeks, one of the largest earthwork complexes in the hemisphere. The trade network itself is one of Poverty Point's most understated puzzles. The site has yielded materials from sources spanning more than 1,000 kilometers in multiple directions. Copper from the Great Lakes region, galena from Missouri and Illinois, soapstone from the Appalachian Highlands, chert from multiple distant sources. This was not a village economy. It was a node in a continental exchange system whose full extent has not yet been mapped, and whose organizational logic, who controlled it, who benefited, what was exchanged for what, remains largely opaque. The objects found at Poverty Point deepen the puzzle rather than resolving it. Thousands of small hand-formed clay objects, known as Poverty Point objects, were produced in a remarkable variety of geometric forms: spheres, cylinders, biconicals, crosses. Their function was almost certainly utilitarian, used as cooking stones in a region where natural stone suitable for that purpose was scarce. But the sheer variety of forms, maintained consistently across the site and across time, suggests a level of personal or group identification embedded in practical objects that hints at a social complexity difficult to reconstruct from the outside. The bird mound watches the sunset. The ridges hold their curve. The trade goods sit in museum cases, separated from the network that produced them. And the people who built all of this, who they were, where they came from, where they went, and what they understood about the landscape they so deliberately shaped, remain, despite decades of careful excavation, only partially known. What were they gathering for? And why, when it was finished, did the gathering end? Poverty Point gathered people and then released them. Whatever the purpose of that extraordinary convergence, ceremonial, cosmological, commercial, or something that resists our modern categories entirely, it ended. The bird mound was completed, the ridges were finished, and the people who built them dispersed back into a continent that was, we are only beginning to understand, far more thoroughly known and far more carefully tended than the history we were taught ever suggested. But there is a dimension of that knowledge, of the deep, intimate relationship between these cultures and the landscapes they inhabited, that does not appear in the earthworks, or in the trade networks, or even in the astronomical alignments encoded into stone and story. It lies beneath the surface. Across North America, from the desert southwest to the forested northeast, from the Great Plains to the Pacific coast, there exists a category of place that appears consistently in indigenous traditions, but has received comparatively little systematic attention from the outside world. These are the places that go down. Entrances, passages, chambers, some natural, some clearly modified by human hands, that descend into the earth and that carry, in the traditions of the peoples who have long known about them, a weight of significance that goes far beyond their physical dimensions. The Hopi tradition is perhaps the most explicit on this point. Their emergence narrative, the foundational story of how the Hopi people came to inhabit the present world, describes a passage upward through a series of underground worlds, accessed through an opening called the Sipapu. The Sipapu is not purely metaphorical. Physical Sipapus, small symbolic holes in the floors of kivas, represent the entrance point between worlds in every ceremonial space the Hopi construct. But tradition also describes a specific, literal location, a site in the Grand Canyon near the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers, where the actual emergence into this world took place. The Hopi consider this site among the most sacred on Earth. It is not open to outside visitors, and the canyon system in which it sits is, geologically, one of the most complex networks of caverns, passages, and underground waterways in North America. The Navajo tradition similarly describes underground spaces as places of transformation and passage, locations where the boundary between the living world and the world beneath it is permeable in ways that carry both spiritual significance and genuine danger. Certain caves and underground passages in the Four Corners region are marked in Navajo knowledge as places to approach with ceremony and caution, not because of physical hazard alone, but because of what they are understood to connect to. These traditions are not unique to the Southwest. The Iroquois Confederacy maintained accounts of underground passages connecting significant sites across their territory. Passages used historically in some accounts for travel, for the movement of people and materials during conflict, and for ceremonial purposes whose nature was not shared with outsiders. The Cherokee spoke of an underground world inhabited by beings they called the Nunyahi, an immortal people who lived beneath the mountains and beneath the waters, whose domain was accessible through specific caves and underwater passages, and whose relationship with the human world was one of cautious, conditional exchange. The physical evidence, where it has been examined, is fragmentary, but not negligible. In the American Southwest, genuine tunnel systems have been documented at several sites associated with ancestral Puebloan and Hohokam occupation. Some of these are clearly functional: drainage channels, storage passages, connections between structures in complex multi-room architecture. But others have proved more difficult to categorize. At certain sites, passages have been found that do not connect to obvious functional endpoints, that contain evidence of repeated use over extended periods, and that are positioned in ways suggesting deliberate orientation, aligned in some cases with the same astronomical considerations visible in the surface architecture above them. The Manitou Caves of Alabama, a limestone cave system in the southern Appalachians, were used by indigenous peoples for at least 6,000 years. The walls carry thousands of inscriptions, petroglyphs, pictographs, and what researchers have identified as a previously undocumented writing system or symbolic notation whose meaning has not been fully decoded. The deeper passages of the cave system extend far beyond the areas so far systematically documented, and the full extent of the complex remains unmapped. What was recorded on those walls, and why generations of people considered it important enough to carry torches into the deep dark to do so, is a question that the current documentary record cannot answer. The Grand Canyon itself, one of the most extensively studied geological formations on Earth, contains cave systems and passages that remain only partially explored. In 1909, a newspaper account in the Arizona Gazette described the discovery of a large underground complex in the canyon walls, containing chambers, artifacts, and mummified remains of unusual character. The Smithsonian Institution, named in the account as having sent investigators, has consistently stated it has no record of any such expedition or discovery. The account has been widely dismissed as fabrication, but the dismissal has not fully resolved the question of why the story contained specific geographical details that correspond to real locations, or why the canyon's known cave systems include areas that remain restricted and incompletely documented. The pattern, across all of these cases, is one of access withheld, sometimes by the communities who consider the sites sacred and whose reasons for privacy are entirely legitimate, sometimes by the institutional frameworks that control access to federal lands, and sometimes simply by the physical difficulty of the terrain itself. What is consistent, across traditions separated by thousands of kilometers and hundreds of years of independent development, is the understanding that the world does not end at the surface. That beneath the ground on which the visible history was built, there is another layer, older, less mapped, and held more closely. The Hopi know where the Sipapoo is. The Navajo know which caves require ceremony before entering. The Cherokee remember which waters lead down. What is it exactly that lies at the bottom of what they know? And why has so much effort, across so many cultures and so many centuries, gone into ensuring that certain doors remain closed? There are doors, as we have seen, that certain traditions keep deliberately closed. Knowledge held in reserve. Places approached only with ceremony, only with permission, only by those prepared to receive what lies on the other side. That guardedness is not superstition. It is the product of a long and careful relationship with forces that the cultures maintaining these traditions understood to be real, consequential, and not to be engaged with carelessly. Some of those forces moved underground, through the Sipapoo, through the cave passages, through the waters that lead down. Others moved through the sky. Find a large, flat stone face anywhere in the arc from the Pacific Northwest down through the Great Plains and across to the eastern woodlands, and look for it. You may find it rendered in bold, angular lines, wings spread to a span that dwarfs any known bird, a hooked beak, eyes that radiate lines suggesting light or electricity, talons that grip serpents or carry whales. It appears on totem poles in the forests of British Columbia, carved with the same authority as the killer whale and the bear. It appears in the petroglyphs of the Columbia River Plateau. It appears in the beadwork of the Ojibwe, in the ceremonial regalia of the Lakota, in the oral traditions of the Menominee, the Algonquin, the Winnebago, the Passamaquoddy. It appears with enough consistency across enough distinct and geographically separated cultures to constitute something more than a shared artistic convention. It is the Thunderbird, and it is among the most persistent, most widely distributed, and most stubbornly unresolved presences in the indigenous traditions of North America. The Thunderbird is not a minor figure. In the traditions that carry it, it occupies a position of genuine cosmological weight, a being of immense power whose wing beats produce thunder, whose eyes generate lightning, whose presence in the sky signals forces beyond human control. For many nations, it is not primarily a symbol, but an actor, a being with agency, with territory, with a role in the ordering of the world that places it in ongoing conflict with equally powerful forces below, particularly the great underwater serpents or panthers that appear as the Thunderbird's counterpart and adversary across dozens of traditions. This cosmic opposition, sky power against water power, above against below, structures the ceremonial and cosmological understanding of cultures across an enormous geographic range. The consistency of that structural opposition, maintained independently across cultures with no established lines of transmission, is what first draws serious researchers past the easy dismissal. Mythological archetypes can travel. They can spread along trade routes, diffuse through cultural contact, be adopted and adapted by communities that encounter them through interaction with neighbors. But the thunderbird and its adversary appear in traditions so geographically distant and culturally distinct that simple diffusion does not fully account for the pattern. Some researchers in comparative mythology have suggested that the opposition encodes a genuine observation, that the tradition preserves in narrative form a real ecological or meteorological relationship that was significant enough to be independently noticed and remembered by multiple cultures across the continent. That is where the mainstream analysis tends to stop. What lies beyond it is more contested. The paleontological record of North America includes creatures whose physical dimensions align, at least broadly, with what the thunderbird traditions describe. Pterotornis merriami, a condor-like bird known from fossil records in the American West, had a wingspan of approximately 3.5 meters. Its larger relative, Argentivus magnificens, known from South American fossil sites, reached wingspans estimated at 6 meters or more, large enough to carry prey of substantial size. Both are considered long extinct, with the most recent North American Pterotornis fossils dating to the end of the Pleistocene, roughly 10,000 years ago. But that date is not as clean a boundary as it once seemed. Paleontological research over the past several decades has repeatedly demonstrated that megafaunal extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene were not instantaneous events, but extended processes, with some species persisting in isolated populations well beyond the dates established by the earliest fossil evidence. The oral traditions of indigenous North American peoples have, in other documented cases, preserved accurate accounts of animals and events from this boundary period. Mammoths, giant sloths, catastrophic floods consistent with glacial lake outburst events, with a fidelity that has surprised researchers who initially assumed such accounts were purely mythological. If a large predatory bird with a wingspan significantly exceeding any currently known species persisted into the Holocene in isolated regions of North America, the oral record would be exactly the place to look for evidence of it. And the oral record, across an extraordinary number of distinct traditions, consistently describes such a being. Beyond the paleontological framework, there is a body of reported sightings that occupies an uncomfortable position between natural history and anomalous phenomena. From the 19th century through to recent decades, accounts of very large, unidentified birds have surfaced from across the continent, from Alaska, from the Pacific Northwest, from the Great Plains, from the Appalachian Highlands, from the Gulf Coast. The credibility of individual accounts varies enormously. Some come from reliable observers with no evident motive for fabrication. Others are impossible to evaluate. None has produced physical evidence sufficient to establish the existence of an unknown species by scientific standards. What the sighting accounts share with the traditional descriptions is a consistent emphasis on scale, on wings whose span, as estimated by witnesses who saw the creature against a known background, significantly exceeded that of any bird in the current zoological record. The Andean condor, the largest flying bird in the Western Hemisphere by wingspan, reaches approximately 3 meters. The birds described in both indigenous tradition and anomalous sighting reports are consistently larger, sometimes dramatically so. The gap between 3 meters and what the traditions describe is not a small one. It is the difference between something explicable and something that currently has no place in our understanding of what is alive on this continent. Somewhere between the petroglyphs and the paleontology, between the ceremony and the sighting reports, between the deep traditions of dozens of cultures and the edges of what the zoological record can account for, the thunderbird continues to occupy a space that neither complete acceptance nor complete dismissal has successfully closed. The wings are still spread across the stone. The traditions are still being maintained. The sky above the continent is vast, and much of it, even now, is not closely watched. What, if anything, still moves through it that we have not yet found a name for? And if it does, if something that large still crosses the sky on occasion, unseen by the instruments we trust, and noticed only by those who know where and how to look, what would it mean that the traditions never stopped watching for it? The sky has been watched. That much is clear. Watched with patience, with ceremony, with a seriousness of purpose that persisted across generations and survived disruptions that would have erased less carefully maintained traditions. The Thunderbird moved through the upper world, carrying storm and consequence on wings that the stone still remembers. And in the cosmological framework that most North American indigenous traditions share, that upper world had a mirror, a domain of equal power, equal danger, and equal significance, pressing upward from below. The great serpent, the underwater panther, the horned and feathered water being that lives in the deep places of rivers and lakes, and whose power stands in perpetual opposition to the power of the sky. We have encountered this figure already, moving through the traditions alongside the Thunderbird, its adversary and its complement. But somewhere in the rolling hills of southern Ohio, the relationship between these forces was given a form so large, so deliberate, and so precisely executed that it has resisted explanation for over a century and a half of serious investigation. Stand on the ridge above Brush Creek in Adams County, Ohio, and look down the length of what appears, at ground level, to be a low, sinuous earthen embankment winding through the trees. From this vantage, the full form is difficult to perceive. Step back, further back than the ridge allows, further back than the surrounding terrain makes possible without elevation, and the form clarifies. A serpent, rendered in earth at a scale that the human eye cannot take in from any ground-level position, its body coiling through 3 wide curves before tightening into a triple-coiled tail, its open mouth extended toward or around an oval feature at its head that researchers have variously interpreted as an egg, a frog, or a celestial body in the act of being consumed or released. The Great Serpent Mound stretches approximately 420 meters from tail to the tip of its open jaws. Its body averages roughly 3 meters in height and between 6 and 9 meters in width, maintained with a consistency that required sustained attention and correction across the construction period. The oval at the head is 37 meters along its longest axis. The entire form was built on a ridge that itself curves. The builders did not choose flat ground, but positioned the serpent along a natural landform whose shape complemented and amplified the effigy's sinuous movement. That choice of location is, on reflection, extraordinary. The ridge on which Serpent Mound sits is not an ordinary geological feature. It is the eroded remnant of an ancient meteorite impact, a crypto-explosion structure, as geologists call it, where a large impactor struck the Earth roughly 300 million years ago, deforming the bedrock in a roughly circular pattern that subsequent erosion has exposed as a series of concentric ridges. The people who built the Serpent Mound either knew, through direct observation over generations, that this ground was different, that its geology was unusual, that it sat at the center of a circular disruption in the Earth's surface, or they selected it for reasons that coincidentally placed their most significant earthwork on one of the most geologically anomalous landforms in the eastern part of the continent. Neither possibility is comfortable to sit with. Both raise questions that have not been resolved. The dating of Serpent Mound has itself proven unexpectedly complicated. Early investigations in the 19th century, conducted by Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, and later by Frederick Putnam of Harvard, associated the mound with the Adena culture on the basis of nearby burial mounds containing Adena artifacts. That association placed construction somewhere between roughly 800 BC and 100 AD. A radiocarbon study conducted in the 1990s on charcoal recovered from the mound's core produced dates centering around 1070 AD. The Fort Ancient Culture period, roughly contemporary with the construction peak at Cahokia. More recent analysis has challenged the 1990s dating on methodological grounds, suggesting the charcoal sampled may have been intrusive rather than original to the construction event. The question of when exactly the serpent was built remains technically open. What is not disputed is the astronomical precision embedded in its orientation. The head of the serpent and the oval feature toward which its jaws are directed aligns with the sunset on the summer solstice. The three major curves of the body have been analyzed in relation to other solar and lunar events, with researchers identifying alignments to the solstices, equinoxes, and potentially to the lunar standstill cycle. The same 18-year oscillation in the moon's orbital position that appears to have been tracked at Chaco Canyon and encoded in Fajada Butte's spiral petroglyph. Whether the serpent was designed as a comprehensive astronomical instrument, or whether the alignments reflect a more general orientation toward cosmologically significant directions, the relationship between the effigy's geometry and the movement of celestial bodies is too consistent to be accidental. The serpent and the sky, again, in deliberate conversation. The traditions surrounding the great water serpent across eastern North American cultures associate it specifically with certain kinds of power. Over water, over the underworld, over the boundaries between the living and the dead. The horned serpent in Algonquin Iroquois and many other traditions is a being that must be approached with the greatest care, whose gifts carry enormous risk, and whose domain is the deep water, the underground, and the transitional spaces where the human world meets something older and less governable. Building an effigy of such a being, at the scale of Serpent Mound, on a ridge above a creek, oriented toward the summer solstice sky. This was not a casual act. It was a statement of relationship, possibly a negotiation, possibly a boundary marker of a kind that operated on principles we have not fully reconstructed. The Fort Ancient people, if they were indeed the builders, left no written explanation. The Adena, if the earlier dating holds, left less still. The mound itself is the document, and it has been read in as many ways as it has been studied. As calendar, as cosmogram, as territorial marker, as ceremonial space, as communication directed at something other than other human beings. It coils across its ridge above the creek, mouth open, tail wound tight, body moving with a sinuous confidence that 400 meters of hand-placed earth somehow, inexplicably, conveys. Who, or what, was it built for? And what was it meant to say to whatever looked down at it from above, or up at it from below? The serpent spoke to whatever looked down from above, or up from below. That is what its builders intended, a communication in earth, at a scale visible only from a perspective that no human being standing on the ground could achieve. It was made to be seen by something other than human eyes, or understood by human minds willing to step outside the ordinary frame of reference. That impulse, to make something for an audience that exists beyond the immediate, beyond the visible, beyond the strictly human, appears again and again in the archaeological record of North America. And nowhere does it appear with more unsettling intensity than on the sandstone walls of a series of canyon systems in what is now southeastern Utah, where an unknown people left behind images so strange, so carefully executed, and so resistant to comfortable interpretation that researchers have been debating their meaning since the moment they were first formally documented. The Barrier Canyon style is the name archaeologists have given to a tradition of rock art found across a geographic area centering on the Colorado Plateau, with concentrations in Canyonlands National Park, Horseshoe Canyon, and the canyon systems of the San Rafael Swell. The sites range from small panels of a few figures to vast cathedral-like walls covered in images that extend across dozens of meters of vertical stone surface. The figures are painted, not carved, but applied in pigments made from mineral sources, organic materials, and substances that in some cases have proven difficult to fully identify. In shades of dark red, burgundy, and occasionally white, with a consistency of technique and aesthetic sensibility that marks them as the product of a single, coherent tradition rather than a random accumulation of individual marks. The dating is imprecise and contested. Attempts to directly date the pigments have produced results ranging from approximately 1500 BC to as early as 7000 BC or beyond, though the earlier dates are considered tentative by many researchers. What can be said with more confidence is that the Barrier Canyon style predates the ancestral Puebloans, predates the Fremont culture that occupied the same region in later centuries, and was already ancient by the time the peoples whose oral traditions might have explained it arrived in the area. The tradition appears to have no direct living descendants. The people who made these images left no other clearly identified cultural trace. They are known only by what is on the walls, and what is on the walls is extraordinary. The central figures of the Barrier Canyon style are the anthropomorphs, human-like forms, though that description requires immediate qualification. They are tall, elongated, tapering toward the base in a way that suggests floating rather than standing. They have no legs, or legs so vestigial as to be functionally absent. Their bodies are often filled with interior decoration, horizontal bands, dots, lines suggesting ribs or organs, geometric patterns whose repetition across multiple sites indicates intention rather than improvisation. Many have no arms, or arms that extend outward in positions that do not correspond to ordinary human movement. Their heads are frequently large in proportion to their bodies, sometimes helmet-like, sometimes horned, sometimes surrounded by what appear to be antennae, or rays or appendages that have no obvious anatomical referent. They are frequently accompanied by smaller figures, animals, insects, serpents, birds, rendered with a naturalism that contrasts with the otherworldly quality of the large anthropomorphs. Dogs or dog-like animals appear repeatedly, positioned near or beside the large figures in ways that suggest attendance or relationship. Insects, rendered in careful detail, appear in contexts that imply significance beyond decoration. At the Great Gallery in Horseshoe Canyon, one of the most extensively documented Barrier Canyon sites, the combination of towering anthropomorphic figures, naturalistic animals, and carefully placed smaller elements creates an effect that trained archaeologists have consistently described in terms usually reserved for sacred or ceremonial spaces. The word that appears most often in the literature, across researchers of varying theoretical orientations, is numinous. The interpretive frameworks that have been applied to Barrier Canyon art are numerous, and none has achieved consensus. The shamanistic interpretation, developed extensively from the 1980s onward, proposes that the images were produced during or in connection with altered states of consciousness, that the elongated, floating, internally decorated figures represent beings or experiences encountered in trance states, and that the imagery reflects the neuropsychological experiences common to deep shamanic practice across cultures worldwide. This framework has been influential and has the advantage of explaining certain recurring formal elements: the phosphine patterns, the sense of floating, the dissolution of ordinary bodily boundaries, by reference to documented features of altered perception. It has also been criticized for being too broadly applicable, for potentially reducing a complex tradition to a single explanatory mechanism, and for relying on cross-cultural comparisons that may obscure more than they reveal. Other researchers have emphasized the astronomical dimension. Certain Barrier Canyon panels have been analyzed for solar and lunar alignments, with results suggesting that some sites were positioned to interact with light at specific times of year. Solstice or equinox light entering a canyon at an angle that illuminates specific figures, or creates shadow effects that alter the apparent form of painted images. If accurate, this places Barrier Canyon art within the broader tradition of astronomically informed site selection that we have encountered repeatedly in this exploration, from Chaco's solstice windows to Serpent Mound's summer alignment to Poverty Point's celestial geometry. The most speculative interpretations, and they are noted as such, point to the non-human quality of the central figures, and ask whether the tradition preserves a visual record of encounters with beings that were not human, not animal, and not easily categorized within the cosmological frameworks that came later. These interpretations have not gained traction in mainstream archaeology, but they have persisted in the popular literature, driven by the simple, difficult-to-dismiss observation that the Barrier Canyon anthropomorphs do not look like people. They look like something else. And whatever that something else was, it was important enough to be painted, with great care and apparent reverence, on stone walls across an enormous geographic area by people who invested significant effort in ensuring that the images would endure. The pigments have lasted thousands of years. The walls that hold them are still standing in the canyon's silence, still receiving the particular quality of light that filters down between the sandstone walls in the late afternoon, still showing whatever it is they were made to show to whoever, or whatever, was meant to see them. What were the people who made these images trying to communicate? And to whom, or to what, were they speaking when they raised their hands to the stone and began to paint? The walls have kept the answer for thousands of years. They have not offered it yet. The canyon walls hold their silence. Whatever the barrier canyon painters were reaching toward, whatever presence they were addressing with those elongated, hovering figures and carefully placed animals, they left no spoken key. No tradition that has been unambiguously traced to a living community, no interpreter standing between the images and the questions they generate. The communication, if that is what it was, moved in one direction only, outward from human hands, into stone, into time. But not every form of sacred marking required a canyon wall, or a specific geographic feature, or the darkness of an enclosed space. Some of the most deliberate, most carefully constructed expressions of relationship between the human world and something larger than it were built in the most open, most exposed places imaginable, on high ridges and windswept plateaus where the sky presses down from every direction and the horizon extends further than the eye can comfortably hold. On these heights, someone laid stones. Across the northern Great Plains and into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, from Wyoming and Montana northward through Alberta and Saskatchewan into the prairie provinces of Canada, there exist more than 150 stone constructions known collectively as medicine wheels. The name is a product of outside observation rather than indigenous terminology. The structures were described by early European observers as resembling wagon wheels laid flat upon the ground, their circular rims and radiating lines of stone suggesting the spokes of a wheel at a scale that only becomes legible from above. The indigenous communities of the region use various names for these structures in their own languages, names that encode relationships and meanings that the neutral term medicine wheel does not begin to capture. The structures vary considerably in size and complexity. The smallest are modest arrangements of a few dozen stones in a rough circle. The largest are genuinely impressive by any measure. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming, set at an elevation of roughly 2,940 meters on a wind-exposed ridge in the Bighorn Mountains, consists of a central cairn of stones connected by 28 lines of laid rock to an outer ring approximately 25 meters in diameter, with 6 smaller cairns distributed around the perimeter. It has been the subject of more systematic investigation than almost any other medicine wheel on the continent, and that investigation has produced results that continue to generate serious debate. The dating of medicine wheels is a persistent challenge. Stone structures without organic material incorporated into their construction resist the radiocarbon dating techniques that have anchored chronologies at earthwork sites. Attempts to date the Bighorn Wheel and others in the complex through various indirect methods have produced estimates ranging from a few hundred years to several thousand. The Majorville Medicine Wheel in Alberta, a large complex structure at the center of a cairn that excavation has shown to be the product of sustained, long-term accumulation, has yielded dates suggesting construction activity beginning as early as 3200 BC, making it potentially among the oldest ceremonial monuments in North America, roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of Stonehenge. That comparison is not merely rhetorical. Astronomer John Eddy, investigating the Bighorn Medicine Wheel in the 1970s, found that specific cairns around the wheel's perimeter aligned with the rising positions of several bright stars, Aldebaran, Rigel, Sirius, and Fomalhaut, at their heliacal rising, the moment each year when a star first becomes visible on the horizon just before dawn after a period of invisibility. These heliacal risings, Eddy argued, served as markers in an astronomical calendar, each star's appearance signaling a specific time of year with a precision useful for scheduling ceremonies, migrations, and other activities tied to seasonal cycles. The alignment with the summer solstice sunrise was also identified and has been subsequently verified by independent researchers. The 28 spokes of the Bighorn wheel have attracted particular attention. 28 corresponds to the number of days in a lunar month, the synodic period of the moon from new to new. It also corresponds to the number of poles in a traditional Lakota sun dance lodge, and to the ribs of the buffalo, and to other numerical relationships embedded in plain ceremonial traditions. Whether the spoke count is astronomically or ceremonially intentional, or both, or neither, remains a matter of active discussion. What can be said is that 28 is not a number that appears by accident in a carefully laid stone structure. The high-altitude positioning of many medicine wheels adds another dimension to the puzzle. The Bighorn wheel is accessible only in summer. Snow covers the site for most of the year, and the approach involves significant physical effort even in favorable conditions. Building there and returning there was a deliberate choice made against the easier alternative of constructing at lower elevations. The height places the structures at the boundary between the inhabited world below and the sky above, a liminal position that appears, in the context of everything else we have examined, entirely intentional. These are not convenient locations. They are chosen ones. The communities for whom medicine wheels remain living sacred sites, the Crow, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, the Blackfoot, and others, maintain relationships with specific wheels that include regular ceremonial visits, offerings, and practices whose details are appropriately not available for public documentation. What is shared is the understanding that these structures are not archaeological relics. They are active places. The relationship between the communities and the wheels did not end when outside researchers began studying them. It continued, is continuing, alongside and largely independent of whatever conclusions the academic literature reaches. Some wheels show evidence of continuous use across extraordinarily long periods, successive layers of offerings, modifications, additions that speak to generations of return. A place visited for 3,000 years is not a monument to a dead tradition. It is a living institution whose age happens to exceed most of what Western civilization has produced. The wind moves across the Bighorn Ridge without pause. The stones hold their positions against it. The central cairn, the spokes, the outer ring, the smaller cairns aligned to stars that have been rising in those positions for longer than the oldest continuous human institution on Earth has existed. Someone understood the sky well enough to encode it in stone at this altitude, with this precision, in this wind. Who taught them? How long had they been watching before the knowledge was sufficient to build what they built here? And what did they understand about the relationship between the high places, the stars, and whatever it is that the ceremonies conducted at these wheels were meant to engage with? The ridge holds no answer. The stones simply point, as they have always pointed, toward the horizon, waiting for the light to arrive at exactly the moment they were placed to receive it. The stones on the Bighorn Ridge point toward the horizon, patient and precise, waiting for the light they were placed to receive. That act, of marking the earth in ways that require distance and elevation to fully comprehend, of building for a perspective that no ordinary human vantage point provides, is one we have now encountered repeatedly across this exploration. At Serpent Mound, the full form of the effigy becomes legible only from above. At Poverty Point, the concentric geometry resolves only at altitude. At the medicine wheels, the spoke and rim pattern emerges clearly only when the viewer steps back far enough to take in the whole. There is a pattern within the pattern. Again and again, across cultures and centuries and geographic distances that preclude simple borrowing, the builders of North America's most significant sacred structures chose forms that were not meant to be seen from the ground. They chose forms that required a higher perspective. They built, in a very real sense, for the sky. Nowhere is that impulse more literally expressed than on the low desert terraces above the Colorado River in Southern California, where a series of figures were created using a technique so simple and so permanent that the images have survived intact for what may be thousands of years, and yet so large, so deliberately scaled, that their makers could never have stood at a distance sufficient to verify what they had made. The Blythe intaglios are a group of figures scraped into the surface of the desert pavement, the layer of dark, oxidized gravel and stone that covers the ground in arid regions and forms over thousands of years, as wind removes finer particles and leaves behind a concentrated surface of larger rocks. To create the intaglios, the makers cleared this dark pavement from specific areas, exposing the lighter-colored earth beneath, and in doing so drew with absence, with the removal of material rather than its addition. The result, visible from the air with stark clarity, is a series of figures outlined in light against the darker surrounding terrain. There are 6 major figures across 3 sites on the terraces near Blythe, distributed across an area of several square miles above the river. The largest human figure measures approximately 50 meters from head to foot. A second human figure at the same site is slightly smaller. Accompanying them are figures identified as animals, most likely a 4-legged creature interpreted variously as a mountain lion, a horse, or a spiral form. At the other sites, additional human figures and a spiral complete the documented complex. The human forms are spread-eagled, arms extended and legs apart, rendered in a posture that appears across a remarkable range of indigenous and ancient artistic traditions worldwide. A posture associated in many contexts with power, with cosmological significance, with the human form as a connector between earth and sky. The dating is uncertain, as it is for most intaglio sites in the region. Estimates based on the degree of repatination, the gradual darkening of the exposed lighter earth as desert varnish slowly reforms, suggest an age of anywhere between 500 and 2,000 years, with some researchers arguing for greater antiquity. The figures were not widely known outside the local indigenous communities until 1932, when a pilot flying over the area became the first outside observer to document them from the air. That date is significant. For the entire period of European presence in the region, the figures lay on the desert floor seen by no one who recorded them, unrecognized, their scale and form imperceptible to anyone traveling at ground level through the surrounding terrain. The Mojave and Quichon peoples, whose traditional territories encompass the area where the intaglios are located, have maintained relationships with these figures that predate any archaeological investigation. In their traditions, the large human figures are associated with specific cosmological beings, creator figures or culture heroes whose stories form the foundation of ceremonial and spiritual practice in the region. The figures are not decorative. They are presences. They mark a specific kind of ground, and the ceremonies historically conducted at and near these sites involved movement, ritual running, dancing, procession, suggesting that the intaglios function not as static monuments to be observed, but as active spaces to be inhabited and engaged with at the level of the body. The scale problem returns here with particular force. A figure 50 meters long cannot be seen as a figure by a person standing next to it, or even standing at its edge. At ground level, what is visible is a subtle difference in the color and texture of the desert surface, a low cleared area that gives no clear indication of form. The makers of these figures had no aerial vantage point available to them by any conventional account of their technology and capabilities. And yet the figure they made is precise. The proportions of the human form are maintained. The posture is intentional and consistent. The relationship between the human figures and the animal forms, visible only in their entirety from a significant altitude, suggests a compositional awareness that the ground-level perspective does not support. How do you verify what you have made when you cannot step back far enough to see it? One possibility is that the verification was never the point, that the figures were made for a perspective other than the human one, and that their makers understood this explicitly. The figures were not made to be seen by the people who made them in the form in which they are legible. They were made to be seen by something else, from somewhere above. If that interpretation is correct, the intaglios are not representations of cosmological beings. They are communications addressed to them, offerings in the oldest medium available, the earth itself, shaped by human hands into a language readable only from the sky. The Colorado River moves along the base of the terraces, dark and deliberate, the way it has always moved. The desert pavement slowly, imperceptibly reforms. The light earth exposed by the clearing grows fractionally darker each century, the figures fading on a timescale measured in millennia rather than years. They are still there, still legible from above, still holding the posture, arms extended, legs apart, of something that was meant to be seen. By what? From where? And what response, if any, was expected from whatever looked down at these desert floors and found in the cleared gravel a human form reaching upward? The desert does not say. The river does not say. And the sky, as always, holds whatever it knows entirely to itself. The sky keeps its secrets. We have seen that, again and again, across this entire exploration. The medicine wheels point toward it. The intaglios address it. The Barrier Canyon figures seem to reach toward something moving through it. The Thunderbird inhabits it, and the astronomical alignments encoded into earthworks, canyon walls, and stone circles across the continent speak of people who watch the sky with an attention so sustained, so serious, and so carefully transmitted across generations that the knowledge survives even now, in traditions that outlasted every attempt to silence them. But there is something else in the sky. Something that does not fit neatly into the category of stars, or planets, or weather, or any of the known phenomena that indigenous astronomical traditions tracked and named and built their ceremonial calendars around. Something that moves differently, that appears and vanishes without the regularity that makes celestial bodies predictable. That has been seen, described, and carefully noted in indigenous traditions across the continent for as long as those traditions reach. And that continues to be seen, in the same locations and with the same characteristics, today. Lights. Unexplained, unattached, self-moving lights that appear close to the ground, above water, near certain landforms, and in proximity to sites that have long been considered sacred. Begin in the high desert of New Mexico, in the wide flat basin between the San Andres and Sacramento mountain ranges, where a phenomenon known as the Marfa Lights, or more precisely, a version of the same phenomenon observed in this broader region, has been reported continuously since at least the 19th century, and in indigenous oral tradition for far longer. Spheres of light, varying in color from white to orange to blue, moving horizontally across the desert floor at heights ranging from ground level to several hundred meters, appearing and disappearing without apparent cause, sometimes stationary for extended periods, sometimes moving at speeds inconsistent with any conventional explanation involving ground-based light sources or atmospheric reflection. The lights near Marfa, Texas, have been the subject of formal scientific investigation since the 1970s. No investigation has produced a complete, universally accepted explanation. The most commonly proposed mechanism, a form of atmospheric refraction involving thermal layers and distant vehicle headlights, has been shown to account for some of the observed phenomena some of the time. It does not account for all of it, and it does not account for the reports that predate the automobile by centuries. The Apache, whose traditional territory encompasses much of the southern desert region, maintained specific accounts of lights in this landscape that were not explained as reflections or weather events. The lights were beings, or the manifestations of beings, presences associated with specific locations, specific times of year, and specific categories of encounter that required particular responses from anyone who witnessed them. The correct response was not investigation. It was acknowledgement, followed by a careful and respectful withdrawal. The lights were not considered dangerous in themselves, but the protocols surrounding them reflected a serious understanding of what they were associated with and what engaging with them carelessly might invite. Move north and east, into the Ozark Highlands of Missouri and Arkansas, and a different but structurally similar tradition emerges around the Hornet spook light, a persistent, luminous phenomenon reported from a specific stretch of road near the Oklahoma border for well over a century, and documented in the oral traditions of the Quapaw and Osage peoples of the region for considerably longer. The light appears most often as a single, orange-white sphere that moves along a defined corridor, approaching and receding, sometimes splitting into multiple forms, sometimes hovering in apparent stillness, before moving again. Scientific investigation has been conducted here as well, with similar results. Partial explanations that cover some observed characteristics while leaving others unaccounted for, and a persistence of the phenomenon that has outlasted every investigative framework applied to it. The Hessdalen Valley in Norway, the Brown Mountain Lights of North Carolina, the Min Min Lights of the Australian outback. This category of phenomenon is not unique to North America, and that geographic breadth is itself a data point. Cultures on every inhabited continent have documented, named, and developed specific protocols for engaging with unexplained luminous phenomena associated with particular landscapes. The consistency of the phenomenology, spherical or ovoid forms, self-directed movement, proximity to water and certain geological formations, association with sacred or ceremonially significant locations, across cultures with no established lines of communication, suggests that whatever is being observed is a real and recurrent feature of the natural world that current scientific frameworks have not fully characterized. In the Pacific Northwest, the Yakama and Umatilla peoples of the Columbia Plateau maintain traditions describing lights associated with specific sections of the Columbia River. Lights that appeared near the water, moved against the wind and current, and were understood as manifestations of the river's spiritual power in a form that could be directly perceived. These were not frightening accounts. They were matter-of-fact ones, embedded in a practical understanding of the landscape that included the luminous phenomena as one of its known, if unusual, features. The lights were part of the river. They had always been part of the river. The geological dimension of these accounts has attracted increasing attention in recent decades. A hypothesis known as tectonic strain theory, developed from the 1980s onward, proposes that stress on certain types of rock, particularly piezoelectric rock types like quartz-bearing granite and similar formations, can produce electromagnetic effects, including the generation of luminous plasma phenomena at ground level or just above it. Laboratory experiments have demonstrated that stressed rock does produce electrical and luminous effects at small scales. The extrapolation to natural field conditions and the suggestion that this mechanism could account for the ball of light phenomena reported in tectonically active or geologically stressed regions remains a hypothesis rather than an established explanation, but it is one that a number of mainstream geophysicists have taken seriously enough to investigate. What is striking, from the indigenous oral tradition perspective, is that many of the locations with the densest and most consistent records of luminous phenomena are precisely the locations with the most significant sacred associations. The places where ceremony was concentrated, where the boundary between worlds was understood to be thin, where the ground itself was considered to be alive and responsive in ways that other ground was not. Whether the sacred significance preceded the luminous phenomena, whether people chose these locations for ceremony because something unusual was already happening there, or whether the ceremonial activity itself produced or intensified the phenomena through mechanisms not yet understood, is a question that neither conventional geology nor conventional anthropology has seriously attempted to answer. The Lakota tradition speaks of what are sometimes translated as spirit lights, luminous manifestations associated with the presence of powerful non-human entities appearing in specific locations and under specific conditions, witnessed by individuals in states of ceremonial preparation and occasionally by those with no ceremonial context at all. The accounts are consistent across generations of testimony. The lights appear, they move, they are noted with seriousness and without hysteria, and they are understood in the framework of Lakota cosmological knowledge as evidence of a world more densely populated and more actively present than the one visible to ordinary perception. That understanding, that the visible world is not the whole of the world, that the landscape contains presences and forces that ordinary attention does not register, but that sustained, disciplined, ceremonially prepared attention can perceive, runs beneath every tradition we have examined in this exploration. It is the foundational assumption of a way of knowing that the dominant culture of the past several centuries has largely dismissed and is only now, slowly and partially, beginning to take seriously. The lights appear where they have always appeared, at the desert's edge, above the dark water, near the high stone places where ceremony has been conducted for longer than written history reaches. They are still being seen, by people driving on ordinary roads, by researchers with instruments, by community members who know what they are looking at because they were told what to look for, and where, and how to respond when the light appears. What are they? The honest answer, in 2025, is that no one outside the traditions that have been tracking them the longest has produced a complete explanation. And perhaps that is the most important thing the traditions have been saying all along, that the landscape is not finished revealing itself, that there are things moving through it, visible if you know how to look, that have not yet been given a name that satisfies. The lights move through a landscape that knows them. That is what the traditions are saying when you listen carefully enough. That the land is not passive, not inert, not simply a surface on which human history happens to have occurred. It is active. It remembers. It participates. And the relationship between the people who have lived within it for thousands of years and the forces that move through it, visible and invisible, understood and only partially understood, is a relationship encoded in every form of marking, every ceremony, every carefully maintained piece of knowledge we have examined in this exploration. Some of that encoding is subtle, alignments that only reveal themselves at specific moments of the year, traditions carried in story that require generations of careful transmission to preserve, lights that appear only to those who know where to look and when. And some of it is anything but subtle. In a shallow canyon in southeastern Utah, where Indian Creek cuts through the red sandstone country of the Colorado Plateau on its way toward the Colorado River, there's a single panel of rock that stops people mid-stride. Not because of its setting, though the canyon is beautiful. Not because of its size, though the panel is substantial. But because of what covers it. A surface so densely packed with carved images, accumulated across so many centuries of continuous use, that it constitutes one of the most concentrated and most bewildering archives of human expression in North America. Newspaper rock. The name was given by outside observers in the 20th century, a shorthand reference to the panel's resemblance to a page covered in print. An analogy that captures the density of the markings while missing almost everything significant about what they actually are. The Navajo name for the site, Tse-Hona, translates as rock that tells a story, or rock that holds many writings. That name is older, and it is more honest. The panel measures approximately 5 meters wide by 4 meters tall, a surface area that, by the standards of individual petroglyph sites, is not remarkable. What is remarkable is what has been done to it. Across the entire face of the Wingate sandstone, carved through the dark desert varnish into the lighter stone beneath, are hundreds of individual petroglyphs. Some estimates place the number at over 600 distinct images, layered across each other in a palimpsest of marks that spans, researchers believe, roughly 2,000 years of intermittent and sustained use. The earliest marks are thought to date to around 200 BC. The most recent identifiable additions were made in the historic period after European contact. Between those endpoints, every culture that passed through or lived within this landscape left something on this rock. Ancestral Puebloans, Fremont people, Navajo, Ute. Historic era visitors whose marks include horses, introduced to the region after Spanish contact, and figures that blend indigenous and post-contact visual vocabularies in ways that document the collision of worlds on a single stone surface. The imagery is extraordinary in its variety. Human figures and postures ranging from the mundane to the ceremonial. Animals rendered with a naturalistic precision. Deer, bighorn sheep, bears, birds, insects, serpents, that speaks to people who observe the natural world with sustained and serious attention. Handprints, footprints, both human and animal. Spirals, geometric forms whose repetition across multiple cultures and multiple time periods suggests shared significance rather than coincidental similarity. Figures on horseback that belong to the post-contact period, sitting alongside images carved 1,000 years earlier, the chronological layers compressed into a single surface, that does not distinguish between them. There are also figures that resist easy categorization. Among the hundreds of identifiable animals and recognizable human forms, newspaper rock contains a number of images that researchers have struggled to assign to known categories. Figures with physical characteristics that do not correspond to any animal in the regional fauna. Humanoid forms with proportions or features that depart from ordinary human anatomy in ways that appear intentional rather than technically imprecise. Objects or forms that have been described variously as tools, celestial bodies, abstract symbols, or things for which the relevant descriptive vocabulary does not yet exist. The temptation, when encountering images of this kind, is to reach immediately for the most dramatic interpretation. To see in the anomalous figures evidence of encounters with non-human beings, or records of events whose nature falls outside conventional historical categories. That temptation should be resisted, or at least held carefully. The history of petroglyph interpretation is littered with confident readings that subsequent research has revised or abandoned, and the ambiguity of carved images is not a problem to be solved by the most interesting available explanation. But the ambiguity is real, and it is worth sitting with rather than papering over with premature certainty in either direction. What the documentary record does establish is that newspaper rock was not a casual stopping point. The concentration of marks from so many cultures across so many centuries indicates that this specific location carried significance that was recognized and respected by every group that encountered it, regardless of their cultural background or their relationship to the groups that had marked the rock before them. Something about this place, its position in the landscape, its relationship to the creek and the canyon, its specific geological character, or something less easily defined, made it a place where marking was appropriate, where the impulse to record, to communicate, to leave something permanent in the stone was consistently activated across 2 millennia of human movement through the region. Archaeologist Polly Shaftsma, whose work on southwestern rock art has been foundational to the field, has described petroglyph sites of this kind as ritual landscapes, places where the physical environment and the human need to engage with what lies beyond ordinary perception converged in a specific location and produced a sustained tradition of marking. The rock is not merely a surface, it is a threshold. The act of carving into it, of penetrating the dark desert varnish to expose the lighter stone beneath, was not simply artistic expression. It was an act of engagement with the stone itself, with whatever the stone was understood to be in contact with whatever lay on the other side of the surface. That understanding, of stone as threshold rather than surface, appears across multiple southwestern traditions with enough consistency to suggest a shared framework rather than a coincidental metaphor. The sipapu in the kiva floor is a small hole, a penetration of the surface, a communication with what lies beneath. The petroglyph is a penetration of the rock face, a communication with what lies within or beyond. The scale and medium differ. The underlying logic is the same. Several of the Navajo figures at Newspaper Rock correspond to beings known from Navajo ceremonial tradition. Yei figures, holy people, presences whose depiction outside of ceremonial context carries specific obligations and protocols that are not publicly documented. Their presence on the rock, alongside the marks of peoples who came before and after, suggests that the site's significance was understood within the Navajo ceremonial framework as continuous with whatever significance it held for earlier occupants. The rock remembered. The new arrivals recognized what it remembered. The desert varnish reforms slowly, imperceptibly, over the carved lines. In another 1,000 years, the earliest marks will be darker, harder to distinguish from the uncarved surface surrounding them. In 10,000 years, they may be invisible. The rock is not permanent. Nothing is permanent. But 2,000 years of continuous, deliberate marking by culture after culture, each recognizing in this specific panel something that compelled them to add their voice to what was already there, is as close to permanence as human expression reaches. 600 images, 2,000 years. Every culture that passed through left something behind. What were they all trying to say? And is there a single message buried beneath the layering of marks and centuries that every one of them, in their different languages, their different cosmologies, their different understandings of what the rock and the canyon and the creek were, was attempting to express? The stone holds all of it. Every mark, every hand, every moment of contact between a human being and this surface, across a span of time longer than most civilizations have existed. It has not translated any of it. Not yet. The rock does not translate. It holds. It accumulates. It receives the marks of every hand that is pressed against it across 2,000 years of human passage through this canyon, and it keeps all of it. The ancestral Puebloan spiral, the Fremont figure, the Navajo ceremonial presence, the post-contact horseman, in a single compressed surface that refuses to sort itself into a legible sequence. That is, in its own way, an image of what this continent has always been. A place where layers of human presence and knowledge and meaning accumulated across timescales that the most recent arrivals have consistently underestimated. A place where the assumption that history begins with written documentation has left enormous amounts of the actual record unread, unrecognized, or actively misinterpreted. We have spent this exploration moving through that deeper record, the earthworks and the canal systems, the astronomical alignments and the copper mines, the oral traditions that preserved knowledge of the stars across millennia of disruption, the marked stones and the shaped earth and the lights that still appear where they have always appeared. Now we arrive at a moment where those two worlds, the deep indigenous world we have been exploring and the world of European arrival, collide directly. A moment that produced one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in the history of the American continent, a mystery that has been framed almost exclusively as a story about Europeans. But that becomes something considerably more complex and considerably more interesting when it is understood as a story about the people who were already here. Stand on the low wooded island of Roanoke, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, and try to feel the weight of what happened here. The island is modest, roughly 12 miles long, 2 miles wide, separated from the mainland by shallow sounds and from the open Atlantic by the barrier islands of the Outer Banks. It is not an impressive piece of ground. It is the kind of place that is easy to overlook, easy to move through without registering, easy to forget. 115 people disappeared here, and the world has been trying to explain it ever since. The Roanoke colony was the second English attempt to establish a permanent settlement in North America. The first, a military expedition in 1585, had ended in failure and abandonment after conflicts with local indigenous peoples and the deterioration of relations that had initially been cautiously cooperative. The second attempt in 1587 was different in character. A civilian settlement, including women and children, intended as a permanent community rather than a military or extractive outpost. It was led by John White, an artist and cartographer whose watercolors of the indigenous peoples and landscapes of the Carolina coast remain among the most detailed and valuable documents of pre-contact life in the region. White's daughter Eleanor gave birth on Roanoke Island in August 1587 to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Weeks later, White sailed back to England to secure additional supplies. What should have been a months-long absence became 3 years, as England mobilized against the Spanish Armada and every available vessel was pressed into national service. White was stranded, his return blocked by the largest naval conflict his country had ever faced, while his family and his colonists waited on an island 3,000 miles away. When he finally returned in August 1590, the settlement was empty. Not destroyed, not burned in the manner of a violent attack. The structures had been partially dismantled in an orderly way, suggesting a planned departure. Possessions had been removed. The heavier equipment, ordnance, supplies, was gone, and carved into a post at the entrance of the earthwork enclosure that had surrounded the settlement in clean, deliberate letters was a single word: Croatoan, carved on a nearby tree were the letters CRO, as though begun and then abandoned, or as though confirming the longer inscription. White had arranged a signal before his departure. If the colonists left voluntarily, they would carve their destination. If they left under duress or danger, they would add a cross above the carving. There was no cross. The word stood alone, unqualified. Croatoan was the name of an island approximately 50 miles to the south, present-day Hatteras Island, and also the name of the indigenous people who lived there, a nation with whom the English had maintained the most consistently positive relations of any group in the region. Their leader, a man named Mateo, had traveled to England twice, had been baptized, and had been given the title of Lord of Roanoke by Walter Raleigh. If any indigenous community in the region would have taken in a group of stranded English settlers, the Croatoan were the most likely candidates. White never reached Croatoan Island. Storms drove his ships away from the coast within sight of their destination, and the combination of damaged vessels, dwindling supplies, and the season's advancing weather made the attempt impossible to complete. He left the Americas for the last time without setting foot on the island that might have answered his questions. The colonists were never officially searched for again with any sustained commitment. The mystery was left, essentially, to the land itself. What the land has returned slowly and incompletely over the 4 centuries since is a set of fragments that complicate every simple explanation. The Lumbee people of what is now Robeson County, North Carolina, an indigenous nation whose origins and affiliations have been debated by scholars for well over a century, have long maintained an oral tradition connecting their ancestry to the Croatoan and to the lost colonists. The tradition describes the integration of English survivors into the Croatoan community, and the Lumbee have pointed to the presence of certain English surnames, Dare among them, in their community's historical records as evidence of that mixed heritage. Genetic studies conducted in recent decades have produced results that are suggestive without being conclusive, identifying European markers in the Lumbee population consistent with early contact, but not sufficient to establish a direct line to the Roanoke colonists specifically. Archaeological investigation on Hatteras Island, the former Croatoan territory, has yielded physical evidence that the mainstream historical account did not predict. English artifacts recovered from excavation layers predating the period of established European contact, a signet ring, a copper farthing token, other small objects whose presence on the island cannot be easily explained without some form of English contact in the late 16th century. The evidence is fragmentary. It points in a direction without definitively establishing a destination. A site on the North Carolina mainland, designated Site X by researchers from the First Colony Foundation, produced evidence of a concealed marking on a map drawn by John White himself, a patch covering what appears to be a symbol indicating a hidden or secondary settlement location, well inland from the coast. Whether this represents a planned refuge site, a location discussed before White's departure, or something added to the map afterward and for other reasons, has not been resolved. But the concealment itself, the deliberate covering of a marking on a document, suggests that someone at some point did not want a particular location to be easily found. The Croatoan people knew what happened. Their descendants, by whatever name they are now known, carry whatever was transmitted across the generations that followed. Whether that transmitted knowledge included specific information about the colonists' fate, and whether any of it has survived the disruptions of the subsequent 4 centuries in recoverable form, is a question that sits at the intersection of archaeology, genetics, and the ongoing relationship between indigenous communities and the researchers who study them. 115 people, a single word carved in wood, a storm that turned a ship away from its destination, and 430 years of questions that the available record has not been sufficient to answer. The island is quiet. The sounds are shallow and wide, and somewhere in the distance, just below the southern horizon, the island that held the answer sits exactly where it has always sat. Still not fully asked. Still not fully heard. The island held its answer. The sounds stayed shallow and wide, and the question of what happened to those 115 people, absorbed into a community, dispersed across a landscape, or lost to something that left no recoverable trace, remained exactly what it has always been, a gap in the record that the available evidence approaches but does not close. Gaps of that kind are uncomfortable. They resist the narrative tidiness that history, in its written form, tends to prefer. But as we have moved through this exploration, the gaps have revealed themselves to be not failures of the record, but features of it. Places where the standard framework reaches its limit, where the conventional tools of historical analysis encounter something they were not designed to handle, and where the most honest response is to hold the question open rather than force a closure the evidence does not support. There is another gap, older than Roanoke by a factor of nearly 10. Located not on a coastal island but in the high desert basin of western Nevada, in a landscape so dry and so still that the things left within it do not decay in the ordinary way. A gap not in a colonial record, but in the deepest record we have of human presence on this continent. A gap in the story of who the first people here actually were, and what happened to them in the long, unwitnessed centuries before anything we recognize as organized cultural life took shape in North America. The cave sits in a low limestone ridge above the Carson Sink, a dry lake bed in Churchill County, Nevada, in the ancestral territory of the Northern Paiute. It is not a large cave. It is not, in any obvious way, a remarkable one. The entrance is modest. The interior is shallow by the standards of the deep ceremonial cave systems we encountered earlier in this exploration. There is no dramatic art on the walls, no evidence of the sustained, generation-spanning ritual activity that marks the Manitou Caves or the sites of the Barrier Canyon tradition. What Spirit Cave has is something rarer, and in its own way more unsettling than any of those things. It has the dead. Very, very old dead. In 1940, a husband and wife archaeological team named Sidney and Georgia Wheeler excavated Spirit Cave as part of a survey of prehistoric sites in the Nevada desert. What they found inside, wrapped in textile matting and partially mummified by the extreme aridity of the cave environment, were the remains of 2 individuals. The preservation was remarkable, not the skeletal remains that typically survive in archaeological contexts, but actual mummified tissue, hair, fingernails, internal structures partially intact. The Wheeler excavation documented the finds, removed them, and placed them in storage at the Nevada State Museum, where they remained for decades, cataloged but not extensively studied, while the world moved on to other things. Then, in the 1990s, advances in radiocarbon dating technology allowed researchers to apply accelerator mass spectrometry to the Spirit Cave remains, with a precision that earlier methods could not achieve. The results, when they came, stopped the field. The primary individual, known as the Spirit Cave Mummy, or more formally as Nevada's Wizened Man, dated to approximately 10,600 years before present. This placed the individual at the very edge of what archaeologists call the early Holocene, in the millennia immediately following the end of the last ice age, at a time when the lakes that once filled the Great Basin were still retreating and the landscape was in the process of becoming the desert it is today. The Spirit Cave individual was not merely old. He was among the oldest human remains ever recovered from North America. And what the physical analysis revealed about him complicated the established picture of North American prehistory in ways that the field has spent the subsequent decades attempting to process. The cranial morphology, the shape of the skull and facial structure, did not fit the expected profile. The standard model of North American peopling, derived from analysis of later skeletal populations and supported by certain interpretations of the genetic record, predicted that the earliest Americans would show physical characteristics consistent with Northeast Asian ancestry, reflecting migration across the Bering Land Bridge. The Spirit Cave individual's cranial measurements did not align cleanly with that profile. They were, in the technical language of physical anthropology, distinct, showing characteristics that some researchers associated with populations from Southeast Asia, the Pacific, or even, in the most cautious formulations, with a morphological pattern that did not match any known reference population with complete confidence. This finding was not unique to Spirit Cave. A series of other ancient American skeletal remains recovered across the continent, Kennewick man from Washington State, Peñon woman from Mexico, Lucia from Brazil, showed similar departures from the expected cranial profile, clustering in ways that suggested the early population of the Americas may have been more diverse, more complex, and derived from more varied source populations than the single migration Bering land bridge model predicted. The implications were significant, and, in some quarters, unwelcome. If the earliest Americans were not the direct ancestors of the populations that came to dominate the continent in later millennia, then the story of North American peopling required revision. Multiple migrations from multiple source populations arriving by multiple routes, including, some researchers proposed, coastal or even trans-Pacific pathways, became frameworks that the evidence was beginning to support, however tentatively. The Northern Paiute Nation, whose ancestral territory encompasses Spirit Cave, followed these developments with an attention shaped by their own relationship to the land and the dead within it. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the federal legislation passed in 1990 that established protocols for the return of indigenous human remains and cultural objects held in museums and institutions. The Paiute filed a claim for the repatriation of the Spirit Cave remains. The claim initiated a legal and scientific dispute that lasted for more than 2 decades, turning on the question of whether the ancient individual could be demonstrated to be ancestrally connected to the modern Paiute community, a question that the skeletal morphology evidence appeared to complicate. The dispute was resolved, ultimately, not by the morphological analysis, but by the genetics. A 2018 study published in a leading scientific journal analyzed ancient DNA extracted from the Spirit Cave remains and found that the individual was, in fact, most closely related to contemporary Native American populations, including the Northern Paiute. The genetic evidence aligned with cultural affiliation in ways that the cranial morphology analysis had obscured, and the remains were subsequently repatriated to the Paiute Shoshone tribe of the Fallon Reservation, who conducted a reburial in 2016 after a federal court ruling in their favor. What the genetic finding did not resolve was the morphological puzzle. The ancient DNA established population affiliation. It did not explain why the cranial characteristics of the Spirit Cave individual and others from the same time period depart so significantly from later populations. Whether this reflects a genuine diversity in the founding population of the Americas, people who looked different from their descendants, whose physical characteristics were subsequently diluted or replaced through population dynamics over millennia, or whether it reflects limitations in the comparative datasets used for morphological analysis, or some combination of both, remains an active area of research. The cave itself was resealed after repatriation. The dry Nevada air continues to preserve whatever else it contains, if anything. And the question of who the first Americans were, where they came from, by what routes, in how many waves, and what became of the earliest populations whose physical traces suggest a story more complex than the standard model accommodates, remains open in ways that even the most recent research has not fully closed. 10,600 years of stillness in that limestone shelter. Tissue preserved past any reasonable expectation of survival. A face that did not match the face the science expected to find. Who was he? Where did his people come from? And what happened in the long centuries between his death and the emergence of the cultures whose descendants still live in this basin today, to the thread of humanity that he represented? The cave has given back what it chose to give. The rest, it keeps. The cave gave back what it chose to give. The bones of a man whose face did not match the expected story, whose genetics anchored him to the land his remains were found in, and whose existence quietly insists that the human history of this continent is older, more layered, and more complex than the frameworks built to contain it have yet been able to fully accommodate. He was reburied, the limestone sealed again, and the question of what came before, of who walked this land in the deep time before the cultures we have named and mapped and partially understood, remains as open as it has always been. That question surfaces in unexpected places, not always in desert caves or canyon walls, or the eroded remnants of earthwork complexes. Sometimes it surfaces in something small enough to hold in one hand. Something that should not exist, that has no agreed-upon explanation, and that has been sitting in a museum display case in New Hampshire for over a century and a half, quietly resisting every attempt to account for it. Pick it up, in imagination, since the original is not available for casual handling, and feel its weight. It is an egg-shaped object, dark gray, roughly 10 centimeters at its longest dimension, made from a type of stone, myelinite, not native to the region where it was found. Its surface is not rough. It has been worked, smoothed, shaped with a care and precision that speaks of deliberate craftsmanship rather than natural formation. And across that worked surface, carved with a delicacy that the stone's hardness makes remarkable, are images. A human face, an ear of corn, a teepee or wigwam form, what appears to be a crescent moon, a circle that may represent the sun, or a full moon, concentric rings. Other markings whose identification depends on the interpreter and whose meaning, if they carry specific meaning beyond decoration, has not been established to anyone's full satisfaction. This is the mystery stone of Lake Winnipesaukee, also known as the Winnipesaukee Stone, or the Meredith Mystery Stone, and it has been confounding researchers, collectors, and casual observers since the spring of 1872, when a man named Seneca Ladd, a businessman overseeing construction work in the town of Meredith on the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee in central New Hampshire, reported that his workers had uncovered it while digging a hole for a fence post. The stone was found, according to Ladd's account, enclosed within a lump of clay at a depth of several feet, with no other objects or features nearby that would provide context for its origin, its age, or the reason for its presence at that location. Ladd kept the stone for the remainder of his life, showing it to interested visitors and corresponding about it with scholars who found it sufficiently unusual to merit attention. After his death, it passed through several hands before eventually being donated to the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, which transferred it to the Museum of New Hampshire History in Concord, where it has been on display, in a case, behind glass, under modest lighting, ever since. The stone has been examined by numerous researchers across the century and a half since its discovery, and what those examinations have established is, in one sense, quite specific, and in another sense, almost entirely unhelpful. The material is myelinite, a fine-grained metamorphic rock formed under conditions of intense pressure and shearing, a type not found naturally occurring in the immediate vicinity of Lake Winnipesaukee. The stone was brought to its location from somewhere else, by someone, for reasons unknown. It has been shaped. The egg form is not natural, but worked, smoothed to its oval profile by a process consistent with grinding against an abrasive surface over an extended period. The carvings penetrate the surface with a precision and consistency that researchers have noted is technically demanding, given the hardness of the material. A hole passes through the stone from top to bottom, drilled, not naturally formed. And the drilling technique, examined under magnification, has produced evidence that has been interpreted as consistent with the use of a tool that rotates, a type of drill whose form implies a level of technological sophistication that sits uneasily with the assumption that the object is straightforwardly prehistoric. That technological question is one of the central points of contention in the stone's contested history. A study conducted in the 1990s examined the drill hole under scanning electron microscopy and concluded that the characteristics of the bore, its shape, the striations on its walls, the nature of the removed material, were consistent with the use of a metal drill bit rather than a stone or organic drill. If accurate, this would date the stone to the post-European contact period, since metal tools of that kind were not available in pre-contact North America. It would also raise the question of why a post-contact forgery or curiosity would be buried several feet underground in a clay matrix, and who would have had both the technical capability and the motive to create such an object. The forgery hypothesis has been raised inevitably and has not been definitively dismissed. Seneca Ladd was a collector of curiosities with an interest in indigenous antiquities and the regional attention that unusual finds could generate. The circumstances of the discovery, reported by workers on a project he was overseeing, with no independent witnesses documented, the object found in a context that provides no datable associations, are not ideal from an evidential standpoint. The forgery scenario is plausible. It is also, on examination, not entirely satisfying. The carvings on the stone, whatever their origin, show a consistency and a coherence that speaks of a unified design rather than a random assemblage of impressive-looking marks. The images chosen, if the identifications are correct, include elements with broad indigenous significance. The corn, the crescent moon, the face, arranged on a surface prepared with considerable skill. The motif combination is not nonsensical. It suggests intention. What that intention was, and whose it was, is the question the stone declines to answer. Several researchers working in the tradition of pre-Columbian contact studies have proposed that the Winnipesaukee stone bears stylistic and iconographic similarities to objects produced in other cultural contexts. Old World contexts in some arguments, or Mesoamerican ones in others, and that these similarities are evidence of contact or influence that conventional history does not accommodate. These proposals have not found traction in mainstream archaeology, where the evidentiary standards for pre-Columbian contact claims are, appropriately, high. The similarities identified tend to be of the kind that appear in many cultures independently: the human face, the crescent, the circle, and do not in themselves establish a specific cultural connection. What remains, after all the analysis and all the argument, is the object itself. Sitting in its case in Concord, dark gray, egg-shaped, 10 centimeters long. A face looking out from its surface with an expression that is impossible to read as anything other than deliberate. A hole drilled through its axis with a precision that the stone's hardness makes remarkable regardless of what tool produced it. A set of images that someone, at some point, considered important enough to render in one of the most demanding carving surfaces available. Where it came from, who made it, what it was meant to represent or communicate or do. None of these questions have a settled answer. The clay it was found in preserved it without context. The stone itself preserves the marks without explanation. It is, in the end, exactly what the museum card says it is: a mystery stone, found in a hole, held in a hand, passed from person to person across a century and a half of puzzlement, waiting with what looks almost like patience for someone to finally ask it the right question. What would that question be? And is the answer already carved into the surface, in a language no one has yet thought to read? The mystery stone waits in its case, patient, unreadable, holding whatever it knows in the precise geometry of its carved surface and the clean bore of its drilled axis. It was found in New Hampshire, in the lake country of the Northeast, in a region that most people, even those who live there, have never thought to associate with ancient mystery or unexplained construction. That assumption deserves to be examined. Because the mystery stone is not the only thing in New England that does not fit the standard account. It is not even the most physically substantial. Across the forested hills and rocky slopes of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, scattered through second-growth woodland and farmland in the backyards of suburban developments built on land cleared in the 19th and 20th centuries, there are structures. Stone structures, built without mortar, with a precision and intentionality that fieldstone walls and root cellars do not begin to account for, oriented in ways that suggest awareness of the sky, and present in numbers that the standard historical narrative of the region has never fully absorbed. There are thousands of them, and their origin is one of the most quietly contested questions in American archaeology. Step into the woods in almost any part of southern New England and walk far enough from the maintained trails, and you will eventually find one. A low stone doorway, partially collapsed or surprisingly intact, opening into a chamber dug partially into a hillside and roofed with large flat capstones laid across upright walls. The interior is small. Most chambers measure between 2 and 5 meters in length, 1 to 2 meters in width, and low enough that an adult must stoop or crouch to enter. The construction is dry-laid. No mortar, no binding material. Stone fitted against stone with a care that has allowed many of these structures to stand for a period whose lower bound is disputed and whose upper bound some researchers place in the thousands of years. The conventional explanation, dominant in mainstream archaeology and in the popular literature of the region for most of the 20th century, is that these chambers are colonial root cellars, storage structures built by European farmers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries to keep vegetables and dairy products cool through summer and unfrozen through winter. The explanation is reasonable on its face. Colonial New England farmers did build stone structures. Root cellars were a genuine agricultural necessity, and the region's abundant fieldstone, deposited by glacial activity across the landscape, made stone construction a practical choice for settlers who needed to clear their fields anyway. The explanation has problems, significant ones. Root cellars built for agricultural storage are functional objects, designed with the priorities of accessibility, capacity, and thermal stability. They do not, as a rule, need to be oriented with astronomical precision. They do not need their entrance passages aligned to admit the light of the rising sun on the winter solstice or the setting sun on the equinox. They do not need standing stones positioned outside their entrances in arrangements that correspond to specific celestial events. And yet a significant number of the New England stone chambers have been found, upon systematic investigation, to have exactly these characteristics. The work of researchers including Byron Dix and James Maver, conducted in the 1970s and 1980s and compiled in their 1989 book on the subject, documented dozens of New England stone chambers with demonstrable astronomical alignments, solstice and equinox orientations, lunar alignments, and in some cases alignments to specific stars whose heliacal risings correspond to times of ceremonial significance in indigenous traditions. Their work was received with considerable skepticism by mainstream archaeology, where the colonial root cellar explanation was entrenched, and where the idea of sophisticated pre-Columbian or early colonial astronomical construction in New England sat outside the accepted framework. That skepticism has not entirely dissipated, but it has been complicated by accumulating evidence. Radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from within or beneath several New England stone chambers has produced dates that the root cellar explanation cannot accommodate. Dates in the range of 500 BC to 2000 BC, well before European contact, well before any colonial agricultural context, have been reported from multiple sites. The dating evidence is not uniformly accepted. Questions about contamination, about whether the dated material was genuinely associated with the original construction, and about the sample sizes involved have been raised by critics. But the pattern of pre-contact dates across multiple independent sites is not easily dismissed as systematic error. The site known as America's Stonehenge in North Salem, New Hampshire, a complex of stone chambers, standing stones, and carved features spread across a hilltop that has been known to local residents since at least the 18th century, has been dated through multiple independent methods to occupation periods ranging from approximately 2000 BC onward, with some evidence of activity considerably earlier. The site has been damaged by decades of amateur excavation and commercial development, which has compromised its evidential integrity in ways that mainstream archaeology has used, not without justification, to discount the more dramatic claims made about it. But beneath the controversy and the damage, there is a genuine complex of stone structures whose age, construction methods, and astronomical orientations resist the standard explanations. The Abenaki, Mohegan, Pequot, Nipmuc, and other indigenous nations of southern New England maintain traditions that include references to stone structures, to chambers and enclosures associated with ceremony, with vision quests, with the preparation of the dead for burial, and with practices whose specific content varied by nation, but whose common thread was a relationship between enclosed stone space and contact with the non-ordinary. The widespread dismissal of these structures as colonial farm features has, in some cases, been understood by indigenous communities as a continuation of a broader pattern, the erasure of evidence of indigenous presence and sophistication from a landscape that European settlement was narrated as having found essentially empty and unimproved. That narrative is exactly what this entire exploration has been examining and complicating. From the canal systems of the Hohokam to the astronomical alignments of Chaco, from the copper mines of Lake Superior to the earthworks of Cahokia and Poverty Point, the continent that European settlers arrived in was not empty. It was not unimproved. It was a landscape that had been known, tended, marked, and understood with extraordinary depth across timescales that dwarf the period of European presence. The stone chambers of New England sit within that larger story. Whether their origin is pre-contact indigenous construction, early colonial adaptation of indigenous building traditions, independent convergent development of similar forms, or some combination of these possibilities that the current evidence does not yet allow us to fully disentangle. They are real structures, present in real numbers, showing real characteristics that the convenient explanation of colonial root cellars does not adequately account for. Walk into one. If you can find one still accessible, still intact, still holding the particular quality of stillness that these chambers seem to generate regardless of the season or the weather outside. The stone is cold. The light from the entrance is the only light. The capstones above you were placed by hands that have been still for a period whose length remains in genuine dispute. Whose hands? When? And what did they understand this space to be? This careful enclosure of stone in the hillside, this deliberate creation of darkness and enclosure in a landscape of open woodland and sky? The chambers do not say. They hold the cold and the quiet with the same impartiality they have always held it, making no distinction between the farmer who stored his turnips here, if that is what happened, and the person who sat in this darkness for reasons that had nothing to do with turnips, if that is what also happened. Both may be true. Neither may be the whole truth. What was this darkness for? The stone chambers hold their cold and their quiet, making no distinction between what they were first built for and what they became across the centuries of use and misuse and reinterpretation that followed. They are patient structures. Stone is patient in a way that almost nothing else is. It absorbs the questions of every generation that brings them to it, and it returns nothing but its own endurance. That patience, that refusal to resolve, is a quality shared by the most challenging objects in the archaeological record. The things that should not exist. The things that appear in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in a form that the accepted framework was not built to accommodate. Some of these objects are genuine anomalies, physical evidence of something real that the standard narrative has not yet found a place for. Others are fabrications, produced by individuals whose motives ranged from financial gain to religious conviction, to a simple human desire to make the world more interesting than the evidence suggested it was. The difficulty, in the cases that matter most, is that the line between these categories is not always where you expect it to be, and the Michigan relics sit directly on that line, one of the most extensively debated, most furiously contested, and most genuinely unresolved collections of objects in the history of North American archaeology. They began to surface in 1890, in the farm fields and riverbeds of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, particularly in the areas around Montcalm, Oceana, and Mason counties. Farmers and amateur excavators began reporting the discovery of unusual objects: clay tablets, copper plates, inscribed stones, figurines, ceremonial objects of various kinds, some clearly modeled on organic forms, others geometric or symbolic in character. Over the following 3 decades, the collection grew to encompass tens of thousands of individual pieces, distributed across dozens of find sites, recovered by a network of collectors and diggers whose relationship to one another and whose excavation methods were, by any rigorous standard, deeply problematic. The objects were unlike anything in the established archaeological record of the Great Lakes region. The clay tablets were inscribed with images and symbols that resembled, and in some cases clearly borrowed from, Old World iconography. Biblical scenes, Egyptian-style figures, what appeared to be Semitic or Proto-alphabetic script. a cosmological vocabulary drawn not from the material culture of indigenous North America, but from the visual traditions of the ancient Near East, filtered through the religious imagination of 19th century Protestant America. The copper pieces were worked in styles that did not correspond to the genuine pre-contact copper tradition of the Great Lakes, the tradition we examined earlier at Lake Superior. But that seemed instead to reflect a set of cultural references more consistent with someone who had read extensively about ancient civilizations and had decided to render them in metal. The mainstream archaeological verdict came quickly and has remained consistent. The Michigan relics, in the professional consensus, are a fraud. A fabrication produced in the late 19th century by a network of individuals, the identity and extent of whose participation has been debated, motivated by a combination of financial opportunity, religious belief in the pre-Columbian presence of ancient Middle Eastern or biblical peoples in North America, and the broader cultural appetite of the period for evidence that would complicate or contradict the emerging scientific consensus about the deep history of the continent. That verdict is supported by substantial evidence. The find contexts were never rigorously documented. The primary figures involved in the collection's growth had financial interests in its expansion. Chemical and petrographic analysis of some pieces has identified production methods and material compositions inconsistent with genuine pre-contact manufacture. Several researchers who examined the collection in the early 20th century identified individual pieces as obvious modern productions. And the iconographic content, the biblical scenes, the Semitic scripts, the Egyptian figures, reflects exactly the kind of material that a 19th century forger with access to popular books about ancient history might have used as source material, rather than anything that would plausibly have arrived in Michigan's river valleys through pre-Columbian contact. And yet, the case against the Michigan relics, compelling as it is in its broad outlines, has a number of details that the fraud explanation handles less cleanly than the confident dismissals tend to suggest. The sheer scale of the collection, tens of thousands of pieces, recovered across multiple counties over 30 years, presents a logistical challenge to the simple forgery narrative. Producing and planting that many objects over that geographic area, over that time period, without detection, without a single participant in the scheme ever coming forward with a credible confession, without any of the production infrastructure being identified, is not impossible, but it is a considerably more complex operation than the phrase obvious fraud conveys. Several researchers who have approached the collection with genuine skepticism rather than predetermined conclusions have noted that the evidence for a specific, identifiable forger or forgery network is, on close examination, less conclusive than the consensus position implies. The James Scotford question is central here. Scotford was a sign painter and amateur archaeologist who was present at many of the early finds and who several investigators have identified as the likely primary forger. The evidence linking Scotford to the production of the objects is circumstantial rather than direct. He was present. He had opportunity. His character and background were consistent with the kind of entrepreneurial deception that the fraud hypothesis requires. But circumstantial presence is not production evidence, and the case against Scotford, examined as one would examine any evidentiary case, is stronger as a narrative than as a proof. A small number of researchers have subjected individual pieces from the collection to modern analytical techniques: X-ray fluorescence, thermoluminescence dating, isotopic analysis, with results that have complicated rather than resolved the consensus. Some pieces have produced results consistent with the claimed antiquity. Others have not. The analytical record is, at best, mixed, and the mixing is itself a problem for both the fraud hypothesis and for any alternative interpretation that claims the collection is genuine. What the Michigan relics definitely represent, regardless of their origin, is a window into a particular moment in American cultural and religious history. A moment when the question of what the continent's deep past contained was being actively contested between scientific archaeology, religious interpretation, and a popular imagination shaped by biblical literalism, nationalist mythology, and the genuine excitement of a period when the archaeological record of the ancient world was being dramatically expanded by excavations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the classical Mediterranean. the desire to find, in the soil of North America, evidence of a lost civilization connected to the great narrative traditions of the Old World was not unique to the Michigan relic collectors. It ran through the culture broadly, through the Mormon theological framework, through the work of serious researchers who had not yet developed the methodological tools to evaluate their evidence rigorously, through the amateur antiquarian tradition that preceded professional archaeology across the continent. Whether that desire produced the Michigan relics, or whether the Michigan relics fed it, or whether the real history of the objects is something more complicated than either story allows, the collection sits in various repositories, partially documented, incompletely analyzed, waiting for a definitive account that the century and a half since the first piece surfaced from a Michigan field has not yet produced. The clay tablets are inscribed, the copper plates are worked, the images are there. Biblical, Egyptian, ambiguous, strange. Made by whom? When? For what purpose? If purpose is the right word for what motivated their creation or their placement in the ground. The fields where they were found have been plowed many times since. Whatever context they once had, genuine or constructed, is gone. What remains are the objects themselves, and a question that neither confident dismissal nor credulous acceptance has yet resolved. What exactly are they?